Section 1. The World Before the Griffins. Settle in, get comfortable, pull whatever you have over you, adjust that pillow, and just let your breathing slow down a little. Tonight we are going somewhere very specific. We are going back to the very beginning of something that a lot of people have a relationship with in a way that is genuinely hard to explain. Not just a show they watched, but a show that was somehow there during certain nights of their life. Late nights, quiet evenings, long weekends with nothing better to do. It has a way of filling a room, of making silence feel less empty. And the thing is, most people who grew up with it never really knew what was happening behind the curtain. They knew the jokes, they knew the voices, they knew the characters. But the actual story of how all of this came to be, the real story, the secrets and the strange details and the decisions that never made it to air, those things tend to live in corners of the internet that most people never find. That is what tonight is about. We are going to go through every secret, every hidden detail, every buried piece of history connected to this show, and we are going to do it slowly, thoroughly, and in a way that hopefully helps you drift somewhere peaceful while we talk. Because the story of this show is genuinely strange in a way that not enough people appreciate. It was canceled. It came back. It predicted things it should not have been able to predict. It had episodes locked away in vaults that, to this day, have never been broadcast on American television. Its creator narrowly escaped dying on one of the most catastrophic mornings in modern history. A voice actor lied about her age to get a role, and nobody noticed for years. The show existed before it existed, built from short films made in a dorm room by a kid who just wanted to make something funny. There's enough here to fill a long night. So let us start at the very beginning, because that is where the most interesting things tend to be. The place where none of this existed yet, and a single person was sitting in front of a drawing board, trying to make something that the world had not seen. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on October 26, 1973, in a small town called Kent, Connecticut. Kent is one of those towns that most people drive through without stopping, tucked into the northwest corner of Connecticut, full of old stone walls and farmland, and the kind of quiet that you either love or find unbearable depending on your personality. MacFarlane was the kind of kid who drew constantly. He started making his own comics at around 8 or 9 years old, selling them to neighbors for about $1.50 each, a little business that his parents encouraged. He had an aptitude for it that was visible early, the kind of thing that makes adults stop and pay attention in a different way than they usually do with children doing arts and crafts. He went on to study at the Rhode Island School of Design, a place known as RISD, which is one of the most respected art and design schools in the country. It is located in Providence, Rhode Island, which is a detail that will matter later in ways that feel almost planned, though they were not. RISD is the kind of place where the hallways have a particular smell of ink and gouache, where every person you pass is carrying something they made. MacFarlane arrived there with the intention of eventually working for Disney, which was where he figured the career path led. He even changed his mind partway through after watching The Simpsons begin its extraordinary run on television. That show made him realize that what he actually wanted to do was work in primetime animation, which was a different beast entirely from what Disney was doing at the time. During his senior year at RISD, MacFarlane made a thesis film. This is the piece of work that every student at that school creates at the end of their education as a kind of capstone project, the thing you show to prove you have learned something. His was called The Life of Larry, and this short film, created in 1995 by a 21-year-old in the middle of his education, is the direct ancestor of everything that would come after. The Life of Larry was a short animated film about a man named Larry Cummings. Larry was a middle-aged, overweight, somewhat dim-witted man who lived with his patient wife Lois, his heavy teenage son Milt, and his cynical talking dog named Steve. The film featured live-action segments where McFarlane himself, shot at his childhood home in Kent, sat in front of the camera and pitched the film as if he were trying to sell it to a television network. He was being served cheesecake during these segments by a fellow student playing a character named Wang, and the whole thing had the strange, slightly raw, genuinely funny energy of someone making art that was ahead of where they were supposed to be. When you watch The Life of Larry now, which you can find in various corners of the internet, the resemblance to what would become the show is unmistakable. Larry would become Peter, Steve would become Brian, Lois kept her name, Milt became a version of Chris. McFarlane had based Larry's speaking voice, a slightly flat, working class New England accent, on a security guard he had overheard talking during his time at RYSD. He was walking through a building one day, heard this man talking on the other side of a window, and thought something about that voice was useful. He stored it, the way creative people tend to store things that catch their attention, and used it when he needed it. The professor to whom McFarlane submitted his thesis film did something that changed the trajectory of his student's life without quite meaning to. He sent the film to the animation studio Hanna-Barbera, which at that time was one of the most established names in the world of television animation. Hanna-Barbera had produced decades of cartoons. The people there were experienced, connected, and always looking for new talent. They received The Life of Larry and liked what they saw. McFarlane was recruited during the Senior Film Festival, reportedly by a development executive named Ellen Cockrell and the studio's president Fred Seibert. He was hired by Hanna-Barbera based not on his drawing ability, which was solid but not exceptional, but on the strength of the writing in his film. This is an unusual distinction for a place like Hanna-Barbera to make, and it tells you something about how strongly the material registered. He graduated in 1995 with a Bachelor of Fine Arts and moved to Hollywood to work at Hanna-Barbera. He was 21 years old. He wrote and storyboarded for shows including Dexter's Laboratory, Cow and Chicken, and Johnny Bravo, spending the most time on Johnny Bravo because the show used a script writing process that gave him room to develop his own voice. He also did freelance work for Walt Disney Television Animation, writing for a show called Jungle Cubs and for a Canadian production company called Nelvana, where he wrote for an animated version of Ace Ventura, Pet Detective. He would later describe the Disney writing work as unexpectedly valuable, saying that the strict story structure requirements at Disney taught him a great deal about how to build a scene properly. In 1996, while still at Hanna-Barbera, he made a follow-up to The Life of Larry. This one was called Larry and Steve, and it was made for a Cartoon Network showcase program that aired different short animated films under the banner of World Premiere Toons. Larry and Steve focused more specifically on the relationship between Larry and his dog, and in this version, the format changed slightly. Only Larry could understand what Steve was saying. The rest of the world saw a regular dog while Larry carried on full conversations with him, a dynamic that would map almost directly onto the Brian and Peter relationship in the finished series. There is also a pilot character in Larry and Steve who has a distinctive square jaw and a voice that sounds remarkably like a certain neighbor, who would later be known for his particular catchphrase, though he would not arrive on screen in his final form for a few more years. The name Stewie, interestingly, appears in Larry and Steve. Larry mentions a furniture store called Stewie's in the short film. Whether this was intentional foreshadowing or just a name that was floating around in McFarlane's creative vocabulary is unclear, but it is the kind of detail that becomes fascinating in hindsight. The executives at Fox Broadcasting Company saw both of the Larry shorts. They reached out to McFarlane and negotiations began. He had actually tried to pitch a project to Fox before during his time at Hanna-Barbera, and the pitch had not gone anywhere. But this time, with the shorts as physical evidence of what he could do, the conversation moved forward. Fox proposed that McFarlane create a 15-minute demonstration pilot for a potential series based on the characters and gave him a budget of $50,000 to make it. McFarlane later described the creation of that pilot as 6 months of almost no sleep and no social life, sitting in his kitchen drawing constantly, building something from nothing. He pitched the completed demo to Fox on May 15th, 1998. He was 24 years old. The Griffin family appeared in that pilot essentially fully formed. Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, Brian, the fictional town of a Rhode Island suburb where they lived. The show had a name, it had a style, it had a very specific sense of humor that was unlike anything else on television at the time. Fox greenlit it immediately and ordered a full season. The series was originally planned to debut as a series of short films for a sketch show called MAD-TV, but that idea was abandoned because MAD-TV's budget was not large enough to support animation production. Fox was where McFarlane had always wanted to take it anyway, because Fox was the home of The Simpsons, and primetime animation on Fox was where he felt the show belonged. One final detail from this period worth knowing. The original pilot that McFarlane submitted to Fox included a character concept and a voice for the family's neighbor, Glenn Quagmire, but the character's voice was modeled on old-fashioned American radio announcers from the 1940s and 1950s. The kind of smooth, exaggerated showman energy that those broadcasts had. McFarlane has described Quagmire's voice as being inspired by those types of performances. And if you go back and listen to old radio commercials from that era, the connection is audible. There is something buried in that character that is genuinely from another time, which is part of what makes him feel different from the rest of the cast. The show had a premiere date, it had a slot, it had one of the most watched moments of the entire television calendar as its launch pad. January 31st, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33. 22 million viewers would be sitting in front of their televisions already. And the show about a Rhode Island family and their strange, brilliant, murderous baby would be waiting for them when the game was over. If you are still with us and enjoying this, drop us a comment right now. Tell us the time and the place, where you are, what time it is, what you are doing tonight. We love hearing from you, and it genuinely helps the channel more than you might think. And if you have not already, a subscribe costs nothing, and it means everything. Section 2. The voices behind the curtain. There is something hypnotic about the idea of a voice recording booth. You have probably seen them in documentaries or behind-the-scenes footage. A fairly small room, usually darkened, with foam on the walls to kill any echo. A microphone at the center, a music stand or script holder, and a person standing in front of all of that, alone, making sounds that will eventually be synchronized with images drawn by hundreds of people across multiple countries, becoming something that millions of people will watch without ever thinking about the quiet room where it started. The voices of Family Guy were assembled in a way that was partly planned and partly accidental. And the stories behind how each actor came to inhabit their character are as strange and specific as the show itself. Seth MacFarlane voices 4 of the main characters: Peter Griffin, the central figure of the family; Brian Griffin, the dog; Stewie Griffin, the baby; and Glenn Quagmire, the neighbor. He chose to voice all 4 of them himself because he had already heard all 4 voices clearly in his own head and did not trust that anyone else would be able to replicate what he was imagining. He has said in interviews that he had developed such a specific internal sense of who each character was that it felt simpler to just do it himself than to try to translate that to another performer. This is not an unusual instinct for a creator who is also a trained voice actor, but the scope of it is remarkable. 4 distinct, immediately recognizable voices, all living inside one person's vocal range. Peter's voice came from that security guard at RISD. McFarlane would hear him talking through a window or across a hallway, and the voice just stuck. There is a quality to it that is hard to describe precisely. It is a working class New England accent, slightly nasal, with a particular pattern of emphasis that makes even ordinary sentences sound like they are building towards something. McFarlane heard it once, and it became the foundation for a character that hundreds of millions of people would recognize. Stewie's voice is modeled on the English actor Rex Harrison, specifically his performance in the 1964 film My Fair Lady, in which Harrison plays the demanding, imperious Professor Henry Higgins. McFarlane has described Stewie as essentially an evil Rex Harrison, and once you know that, you cannot unhear it. That clipped, authoritative, slightly theatrical British cadence, the way certain words get bitten off at the end, as if the speaker is barely tolerating the effort of pronouncing them, is lifted almost directly from Harrison's performance. McFarlane has called Stewie a diabolical villain trapped in the body of an infant, and the voice is the delivery mechanism for that contradiction. Brian is McFarlane speaking in his own natural voice. This is one of the most interesting choices of all four, because it means that the character who is the smartest, most grounded, most introspective member of the Griffin household is the one that McFarlane performs without any vocal transformation at all. He has said that the connection between his own voice and Brian's was intentional, that Brian represented a certain version of his own sensibility, the intellectual who is maybe a little too confident in his intelligence, who has ambitions that sometimes outrun his actual accomplishments. Quagmire, as mentioned, came from those 1940s radio performers. That specific kind of entertainment salesman energy with the slicked back delivery and the punchline ready cadence. McFarlane has talked about being genuinely fascinated by the style of those old broadcasts as a child. And something about that fascination fed directly into one of the show's most memorable supporting characters. Now, here is where the story of the voice cast gets genuinely strange. Alex Borstein, who voices Lois Griffin, was approached to do the pilot while she was working as a cast member on the sketch comedy show MATE. She had never met McFarlane and had never seen any of his artwork. She agreed to help out with the pilot on almost no information, describing it as being sight unseen. At the time, Borstein was performing in a stage show in Los Angeles in which she played a redheaded mother. The voice she used for that character was based on one of her own cousins. That voice, rooted in a specific person Borstein knew, became the foundation of Lois Griffin. When McFarlane first heard Borstein's initial recording, his response was to ask her to make it less annoying and speed it up, because at the original tempo it was so slow that he felt every episode would run 4 hours. The resulting voice, slightly sped up and sharpened, is what we know. Borstein has described the voice as a blend of Long Island and hungry, which sounds like a strange combination until you actually listen to it and realize that is exactly right. Here is something that most people who watched the show for years never knew. When Family Guy was moving from pilot presentation to full series, Fox Network executives were not certain they wanted Borstein to continue. She revealed at the Paley Center Festival in 2006 that the network had wanted to replace her and that she had been forced to re-audition for the role she had essentially invented, competing against, as she put it, every female actress who had ever stepped off a bus in Hollywood. She won the audition again. She kept the job. But the idea that Lois Griffin, one of the most recognized voices in animated television, almost did not happen because a network committee was unsure about her, is the kind of detail that quietly changes how you think about what we almost lost. The casting of Meg Griffin is a story with more layers than most people realize, and it contains one of the most casually remarkable lies in Hollywood history. The character had three different voice actresses attached to it before landing on the one who would define the role for decades. The first was a woman named Cree Summer, a veteran voice actress best known for providing the voice of Elmira in Tiny Toon Adventures. She was actually hired for the original pilot presentation, but was fired by producers before she ever recorded a single line, replaced before the session even happened. Then came Lacey Chabert, who was at the time best known for her role as Claudia Salinger on the drama series Party of Five. Chabert voiced Meg for the entire first season of the show, which was 14 episodes, but she was never once credited in the opening sequence. Her name did not appear in the credits. This was a contractual arrangement that, looking back at it, seems difficult to fully explain, but it meant that the majority of viewers watching the first season had no idea who was providing the voice. Schabert has described her departure as her own decision, driven by the time pressures of still being in school and still working on Party of Five simultaneously. McFarlane, speaking about it in 2003, described it more simply as a contractual issue, using language that suggested there had been some confusion about the terms of her agreement. Then came Mila Kunis, and this is where the extraordinary lie enters the story. Kunis was born in 1983. She auditioned for the role of Meg Griffin in 1999 when she was 15 years old. At the time, there were rules in place about how young a performer could be while working on certain kinds of productions. And a 15-year-old auditioning for a raucous animated comedy with adult content was potentially a problem. So Mila Kunis told the producers she was 18. She was not. She was 15, already starring on that 70s show, which had premiered in 1998 when she was 14. She lied about her age, they believed her, and she got the job. This is not a secret that Kunis has hidden. She has discussed it in interviews, describing it matter-of-factly as something she did because she wanted the role. McFarlane, who recalled her audition at PaleyFest, described her as someone who naturally took over a scene from the moment she walked in. He said her presence informed how the character of Meg developed, giving her what he described as a sort of resentful Jan Brady quality, the sister who is painfully aware of being overlooked. Seth Green's path to Chris Griffin is one of those stories that sounds made up, but is confirmed by multiple people who were in the room. When auditions were being held for Chris, the producers were hearing a lot of performers coming in and doing variations on a surfer dude voice, which was the general idea they had in mind for the character. Then Seth Green walked in. Green had been dared by his co-star from the 1998 film Can't Hardly Wait, a man named Charlie Korsmo, to base his audition on an impression of Buffalo Bill, the serial killer played by Ted Levine in The Silence of the Lambs. The specific brief was to do Buffalo Bill as an 11-year-old boy speaking through a public address system at a McDonald's. Green did it. The room was reportedly unsettled and fascinated simultaneously. McFarlane hired him. And that is the voice. The awkward, slightly off, oddly disturbing yet harmless voice of Chris Griffin is rooted in a dare, a serial killer from a horror film, and a fast food restaurant. Every time you hear Chris speak, that is the chain of events you are hearing the result of. Mike Henry, who voices a remarkable range of characters including Herbert, Bruce, Consuela, and the greased-up deaf guy, and who until 2020 also voiced Cleveland Brown, met McFarlane at the Rhode Island School of Design, making him one of the most direct through lines between RISD and the show's eventual cast. Henry's brother Patrick was in McFarlane's class. Henry and McFarlane stayed in contact after graduation, which meant that when McFarlane was assembling people for the show, Henry was one of the first people he called. Henry's contribution to the show's vocal landscape is enormous, even though the characters he plays tend to be supporting roles. And the fact that his connection to McFarlane runs all the way back to college is one of those quiet continuities that the show carries without ever advertising. There are voices in the show that most people recognize instantly, but never think about in terms of their real world origin. The show's theme song, the one that begins with Peter and Lois at the piano in their living room, and then becomes a full production number featuring the whole family, was written by Walter Murphy, who became the show's primary composer and musical director. McFarlane has described the theme as being inspired by an older television theme song that he loved from his childhood, carrying that sense of cheerful warmth that television families of a certain era projected before the opening credits began. There is a specific kind of alchemy that happens when a voice becomes a character. The voice is not just a sound, it becomes the emotional logic of a person. When Brian speaks in McFarlane's own natural voice, we hear something that is simultaneously familiar and slightly alien. A person who sounds reasonable but whose choices are often not. When Stewie speaks in that clipped, imperious British tone, we hear the gap between how sophisticated he sounds and how absurd his situation is. That gap is the joke, and it never stops working because the voice never wavers. Patrick Warburton, who voices Joe Swanson, the paraplegic police officer who is one of Peter's closest friends, brings something to the show that is worth pausing on. Warburton's natural voice is one of the most recognizable in American entertainment, a deep, rolling baritone with a kind of perpetual authority to it, the voice of someone who is accustomed to being listened to. Giving that voice to a character in a wheelchair, a character who is both heroic and frequently the object of the show's more pointed jokes about disability, creates an interesting tension that the show occasionally explores and occasionally ignores. In the early seasons, Warburton's performance gave Joe a dignity that made him genuinely compelling as a character. The voice was part of that. The recording process for animated shows like this one is worth understanding, because it is different from what most people imagine. Voice actors typically record alone or in very small groups, standing in front of a microphone with a script, delivering their lines without the context of seeing or hearing the other characters. The emotional reactions, the interruptions, the overlapping banter, all of that gets assembled in editing afterward. Occasionally, cast members will record together to try to capture a more natural conversational energy, but it is not the norm. This means that every performance is, to some extent, a performance of imagination, the actor conjuring the other characters in their mind and responding to them without those characters actually being present. There is one notable exception in the show's history, and it happened in what many fans consider to be the most extraordinary episode Family Guy ever produced. In the 8th season episode called Brian and Stewie, Seth MacFarlane voices both characters in what is essentially a one-act stage play set inside a bank vault. He recorded both sides of the conversation, and the episode was produced without any other voice actors involved at all. For a half hour, it was just MacFarlane talking to himself in a recording booth, playing both characters, exploring the depths of their friendship and their fears in a way that the show had never attempted before and has never quite replicated since. The episode has no cutaway gags, it has no background music. It is just two voices in a room, and it remains one of the most unusual things ever produced in the history of primetime animation. Section 3. The Death, the Resurrection, and the Vault. There is a particular quality to the story of what happened to Family Guy between 2002 and 2005 that makes it feel less like a chapter in a television show's history and more like a folktale about something that should not have been possible. Shows get canceled. When that happens, the assumption is that they stay canceled. The actors move on, the writers find other work, the sets are dismantled, and the thing that existed is allowed to settle into memory. That is how it works. It has almost always worked that way. Family Guy was not cooperative about any of that. The first season had premiered on January 31st, 1999, following Super Bowl 33, and that premiere had drawn roughly 22 million viewers. For context, this is an enormous number. Getting tens of millions of people to watch anything in a single sitting is genuinely difficult. And while the Super Bowl effect inflated that number considerably, since many of those people were simply already watching television and stayed tuned, the show held on to a meaningful portion of that audience through the season. The first season averaged 12.8 million households, which ranked the show at number 33 in the overall Nielsen ratings for that broadcast year. For a brand new animated comedy, that was respectable. Then Fox started moving the show around. In season 2, Family Guy was shifted to Thursday nights at 9 p.m., which placed it in direct competition with Frasier on NBC, one of the most polished and critically admired comedies on television at the time. Frasier was entering the peak of its run and drew massive audiences. Family Guy lost that competition badly. Fox then moved the show to Tuesday nights, where it was now competing with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC, which at that time was something close to a national obsession, drawing numbers that could compete with almost anything on television. Family Guy lost that competition too. The pattern continued. Fox kept shuffling the show between time slots and between nights without giving the audience any consistent place to find it. The audience, quite reasonably, stopped finding it. Ratings continued to slide. After the third season finished in February 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy. One episode from the third season had not even aired yet, and that episode, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, which involved Peter's journey to find Jewish financial advice, was deemed too risky by the network and was simply held back. So the show ended. Or it appeared to. Here's the thing that nobody predicted. Cartoon Network had been building out its late-night programming block called Adult Swim, which was designed specifically for adult audiences and aired in a block after the children's programming ended at night. Someone at Cartoon Network, in what turned out to be one of the most financially shrewd decisions in cable television history, looked at a recently canceled animated comedy that nobody seemed to want anymore and bought the rights to broadcast reruns of it. The price they paid was, by all accounts, almost nothing. The show had been canceled twice in its short life, and its commercial value was considered minimal. Cartoon Network was essentially paying for scrap. Family Guy premiered in reruns on Adult Swim on April 20th, 2003, and it immediately became the highest-rated show on the entire block. The numbers were not marginal. The show did not quietly find a small but loyal audience. It dominated. It boosted Adult Swim's viewership in its time slot by 239%. Think about what that means. A show that had been canceled by Fox because not enough people were watching it was on a different network in a later time slot, aimed at a slightly older audience, pulling in more viewers than almost anything else on cable at that hour. The show had not changed. The audience had not changed. The context had changed. On Adult Swim, in the late-night hours with a different kind of viewer and a different kind of atmosphere, Family Guy was exactly the right thing. At the same time, something else was happening that nobody in the television industry had fully anticipated. DVD sets had become a legitimate market. The first and second seasons of Family Guy were released on DVD in the same week that the show debuted on Adult Swim, and the sales were extraordinary. The season 1 and 2 collections sold 2.2 million copies, making it the best-selling television DVD of 2003. The only DVD set to outsell it that year was the first season of Comedy Central's Chappelle Show. The third season collection sold over 1 million copies as well. People were not just watching the reruns on television. They were physically buying discs and watching the show at home, on their own schedule, in their own time. This combination of massive Adult Swim ratings and record-breaking DVD sales created a situation that Fox could not ignore. They had canceled a show. That show was now generating more excitement and more revenue than almost anything they had on the air. On May 20th, 2004, Fox ordered 35 new episodes of Family Guy, marking what television historians would later identify as the first time a series had been brought back from cancellation, based primarily on the strength of DVD sales. It was genuinely unprecedented. A canceled show had essentially built its own evidence base through the consumer market and forced a network to reconsider a decision they had made 2 years earlier. Season 4 premiered on May 1st, 2005, to 11.85 million viewers. The audience that had been scattered across Adult Swim reruns and DVD purchases coalesced back into a primetime audience and showed up in enormous numbers for the return. Fans who had mourned the show, who had written letters and signed petitions, and bought the DVDs specifically to demonstrate that there was commercial demand, were rewarded. But here's the piece of this story that gets less attention than it deserves. During those 3 years between cancellation and revival, something happened with the unaired episode. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein had been sitting in a vault since 2000, deemed too risky by Fox for broadcast. Adult Swim, which had a different relationship with controversial content and a different sense of what its audience could handle, agreed to air it. The episode broadcast on Adult Swim on November 9th, 2003, 3 years after it had been produced, and more than 3 years after it was supposed to air. It eventually made its Fox broadcast debut on December 10th, 2004. The episode, which involves Peter Griffin befriending a Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein, played by the real-life Ben Steinlein, and deciding that having a Jewish friend is the key to financial success, was built around a song called I Need a Jew. This song was a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star, the classic melody from the 1940 Disney animated film Pinocchio. The publisher of that song sued Fox. The case wound through the courts, and Fox ultimately won in 2009, with a federal judge ruling in their favor on the grounds of parody. But the 3-year journey of that episode, from production to vault to Adult Swim broadcast to Fox broadcast to legal battle, is one of the more labyrinthine paths any piece of television has taken to reach its audience. The vault, it turned out, was only just getting started. The episode Partial Terms of Endearment would be written during the revival period, produced as the finale of the 8th season, and would go on to become the only Family Guy episode to have never aired on American television at all, to this day. But that story belongs to a later section, and it is worth telling properly. What is worth pausing on here is the broader implication of the cancellation and resurrection. When the show came back in 2005, it had been 3 years since the writers had worked together. The original writing room that MacFarlane had assembled, a group that included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker, had scattered. Writers who leave a show take their particular sensibility with them. New writers who come in bring a different one. The tone of any television show is not just the product of its creator's vision. It is the accumulated sensibility of every person in the room, and the room had changed. MacFarlane was aware of this. He has spoken about the effect of the show's repeated cancellations on the writing staff, describing it as a constant process of having to restaff. Every time the show was pulled off the air, the writers went elsewhere. Every time it came back, some of them returned, and some of them did not, and new people filled the gaps. This is the invisible mechanism behind many of the changes that fans and critics noticed in the post-revival seasons. The reason why the tone gradually shifted, why certain characters began drifting in new directions, why the humor began to rely on different tools. The human infrastructure of the show was never quite the same twice. And yet, for all of that, the show that returned in 2005 was still recognizably the show that had ended in 2002. The characters were intact. The voices were the same. The premise was unchanged. Whatever had been lost in the transition was subtle enough that fans celebrated without reservation. The revival was treated as a victory and almost miraculous restoration of something that had been unfairly taken away. And for a certain stretch of episodes, it earned that celebration. The fourth and fifth seasons produced some genuinely excellent television, alongside the early signs of what would eventually become the show's problems. The vault, though, was always there, waiting for the next thing that would be made and then deemed too difficult to broadcast. Section 4: The Man Who Drew Himself into the Story. There is a detail in Seth MacFarlane's biography that sits outside the story of the show, and yet somehow casts a shadow over all of it, something that makes the existence of every subsequent episode feel slightly more improbable than it already would. It is the kind of detail that, if you included it in a piece of fiction, would be criticized for being too convenient, too dramatically weighted. But it is not fiction. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, Seth MacFarlane was scheduled to fly home to Los Angeles on American Airlines Flight 11. He had spent the previous day in Providence, Rhode Island, speaking at a reception at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design. After the event finished, he went out with friends for drinks. He stayed out late. He drank more than he should have. He went to sleep later than he should have. His travel agent had given him an incorrect departure time for the flight. The gate closed at 7:45 in the morning. His travel agent had told him it closed at 8:15. So, MacFarlane had already, through no fault of his own, been given incorrect information. But the hangover compounded this. He woke up late, moved slowly, and arrived at Logan International Airport in Boston approximately 10 minutes after the gates had closed. He stood at the counter and was told he had missed the flight. American Airlines Flight 11 departed without him. 40 minutes later, while MacFarlane was sitting in the airport lounge waiting for the next available flight to Los Angeles, American Airlines Flight 11 was hijacked by 5 members of Al-Qaeda. The aircraft, a Boeing 767, was deliberately crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City, killing everyone aboard and everyone trapped on the upper floors of the tower. It was the deadliest of the 4 attacks that morning, the deadliest act of terrorism in American history. MacFarlane has discussed this experience in interviews over the years. In a conversation with Howard Stern in 2009, he was asked whether the experience made him feel as though he had been meant to survive, whether he felt as though fate had intervened on his behalf. His answer was memorable in its honesty. He said he was not much of a fate person. He said coincidences happen, that he had missed other flights for the same reason before, and that dwelling on the metaphysical implications of the event was not something he was inclined to do. He acknowledged it had rattled him for the first few weeks. Then he moved on. He did note quietly in that same interview that he had fallen asleep in the lounge after learning his flight was delayed, and had woken up to the news of what had happened. The juxtaposition of that moment, sitting in an airport chair and opening his eyes to a world that had just been fundamentally altered, is one that is difficult to think about without it becoming somewhat overwhelming. Mark Wahlberg, the actor, had also been booked on Flight 11 that morning. He changed his plans the day before, opting to charter a private plane with friends to fly to a film festival in Toronto. In a 2012 interview, Wahlberg made the unfortunate comment that if he had been on the plane, the outcome might have been different, which generated significant backlash and prompted an apology. MacFarlane never made any comparable claim. He simply acknowledged what had happened, said it had not changed his fundamental view of the world, and moved forward. There is an episode of Family Guy from the first season, before the cancellation, before the revival, before any of this happened, called Death Has a Shadow, which is the show's very first episode. In it, Peter Griffin gets fired from his job at the Happy-Go-Lucky toy factory after falling asleep at work on a Monday morning. He collects unemployment insurance under false pretenses, the checks arrive, and the storyline builds from there. This was not a 9/11 episode. This was not a prediction of anything. But there is a particular resonance to the fact that in the show's very first story, the central character narrowly avoids a consequence that should have caught him because of a failure of timing. The show's relationship with prediction is one of the genuinely strange corners of its history. There are moments in the early seasons that, watch now, carry an unsettling weight. The episode Road to Rhode Island, produced and broadcast in 2000, contained a scene involving Osama bin Laden at an airport that aired more than a year before the September 11th attacks. The scene was specifically cut from subsequent broadcasts after the attacks and was removed from at least one DVD release in the United States. It was not retained in the regular rebroadcast rotation for years. MacFarlane's own near miss with Flight 11 did not, as far as any evidence suggests, directly influence the content of episodes that came after. He did not make an episode about September 11th. He did not weave his own survival into the show's mythology in any direct way. What it may have done in ways that are harder to trace is inform the show's ongoing preoccupation with the gap between how close catastrophe comes to ordinary people and how rarely anyone acknowledges it. The show has always been, at some level, about the fragility of comfortable suburban life, about how much has to go right for everything to keep seeming fine. MacFarlane's personal experience of that fragility on a morning when the world cracked open was about as direct as it gets. There are people who believe the show has a history of predicting events before they happen, and this belief has generated a significant amount of internet content. Some of what gets cited is genuine coincidence, the natural result of a show that has been on the air for over 25 years and makes a massive number of references to contemporary culture. When you produce enough content, some percentage of it will accidentally echo things that happen later. That is not prophecy. That is probability. But some of it is harder to dismiss entirely. The show does have a history of being ahead of the cultural curve on certain subjects, of being the first place certain jokes or ideas were tried before they became mainstream. MacFarlane has always been someone whose antenna for where culture is going has been unusually sensitive. And the people who have worked on the show over the years have included writers who similarly had their fingers close to the pulse of the country's anxieties. The 9/11 near miss, though, was not prediction. It was luck, or coincidence, or whatever word you choose for the fact that a specific combination of a hangover, a travel agent's error, and a 10-minute gap at an airport gate left Seth MacFarlane alive to continue making the show for the next 2.5 decades. Every episode that has aired since October of 2001, which is the vast majority of the show's run, exists in a world where that hangover happened to be severe enough and that departure time happened to be wrong enough to keep the gate closed just long enough. It is a strange thing to hold in your mind while watching a cartoon about a family in Rhode Island. But once you know it, it is always there. Section 5. Stewie's Buried Origins and the Episode Nobody Saw. Of all the characters in the show's history, none has a more complicated buried past than Stewie Griffin. The character who became one of the most recognized voices in animated television, whose merchandise sold in shopping malls for years, whose face appeared on everything from coffee mugs to phone cases, arrived in the world with a specific identity and then underwent one of the most dramatic gradual transformations in the history of animation. A transformation that was partly planned, partly circumstantial, and partly the result of decisions made in moments of creative uncertainty that the show never quite recovered from. In Season 1, Stewie Griffin was an evil genius, not in a metaphorical sense, not in the affectionate way that fans sometimes describe a particularly cunning cat. He was genuinely architecturally evil in the way that the great screen villains are evil, with plans and blueprints and weapon systems and a hierarchy of objectives. His main goal was to kill Lois. His secondary goal was to take over the entire world. He built laser guns in his bedroom crib. He constructed mind control devices from parts he ordered through the mail. He built a weather alteration machine. He spoke like a character who had escaped from a James Bond film and been trapped inside a 1-year-old's body, which was, essentially, the joke. MacFarlane has described Stewie's voice as being modeled on Rex Harrison's performance in My Fair Lady specifically, and the choice is precise and deliberate. Rex Harrison's Henry Higgins is one of the cinema's great monsters of casual cruelty, a man who talks about human beings the way most people talk about irritating software glitches. The idea of putting that voice inside an infant, surrounded by the visual vocabulary of babyhood, the yellow shirt, the little white shoes, the diaper, the high chair, the sippy cup, was the foundational joke that made the character work. There is a specific layer to the character's origin that most people, even dedicated fans, are unaware of. When the show was still in its third season, before the first cancellation, MacFarlane had conceived of an arc that would have ended with Stewie coming out of the closet as gay. The plan, as he has described it in commentary tracks, was for the season finale to involve a near-death experience that would lead Stewie to reveal his sexuality. The writers had actually produced an episode titled Queer as Stewie, which would have been the vehicle for this storyline. The show was canceled before the season could complete, and the episode was never broadcast. After the cancellation, and after the revival in 2005, the decision was made to permanently abandon the clean reveal and instead keep Stewie's sexuality in a state of deliberate ambiguity. MacFarlane and the writers in the commentary for the direct-to-DVD film, Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, describe having genuinely debated making Stewie gay in a definitive sense, and ultimately deciding against it because the ambiguity was more valuable as a writing tool. MacFarlane would later say that the writers mostly felt Stewie was almost certainly gay, and were writing him that way, but that locking the character into an explicit declaration would close off certain comedic directions. The phrase MacFarlane used in the commentary is revealing. He said they treat Stewie oftentimes as if we were writing a gay character, and described the flexibility of the character's ambiguous sexuality as allowing for more freedom in writing. In other words, not committing to a definitive answer kept every option open. The show could write Stewie falling for a female toddler named Janet in one episode and making elaborate romantic overtures toward Brian's son, Dylan, in another. And neither episode would contradict the other because no definitive statement had ever been made. This approach has been both praised and criticized over the years. Praised because it created one of the more genuinely fluid and interesting characterizations in mainstream animation. A character who is legibly queer without being reducible to any single identity. Criticized because, for some viewers, the perpetual ambiguity began to feel less like a sophisticated artistic choice and more like the show having its cake, getting the cultural credit for queer representation without taking any of the risk of making an actual statement. What is undeniable is that the character who existed in Season 1 was not the same character who existed by Season 8. The evil plots faded. The attempts to kill Lois went from being a central running joke to being a rare callback. The elaborate weaponry and the world domination scheming gave way to storylines about feelings and friendships and identity. By the time the Season 6 two-parter Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie aired, there was a sense among longtime viewers that this was a kind of farewell performance, a final big night out for the original Stewie, after which the show would acknowledge, at least implicitly, that this version of the character was being retired. The two-parter itself is a remarkable piece of television. In the first episode, Stewie boards a cruise ship and achieves what he has been plotting since the beginning of the series. He shoots Lois. She falls into the ocean. She is, for all the evidence available in that episode, dead. The second episode takes place a year later in a world where Stewie has followed through. He has taken over the world. He is running a global dictatorship from a command center that looks like something from a Cold War film. Lois returns, having survived the ocean and spent a year in hiding. She confronts Stewie. Their final battle is genuinely dramatic in a way that the show does not usually allow itself to be. And then the twist. All of it was a simulation. Stewie had modeled the entire scenario on his computer. None of it happened. The status quo was restored, and everyone lived exactly as before. This twist is the thing that the show would reach for again and again over the years. The dream sequence, the simulation, the reset button. The moment where meaningful seeming events are retroactively declared to have not mattered. It is a useful narrative tool when used sparingly. When it becomes a habit, it teaches the audience that nothing the show does will be allowed to have consequences. And once the audience learns that lesson, a certain kind of investment becomes impossible. After the two-parter, the evil Stewie was mostly gone. He still showed up occasionally, still had his time machine, still referenced his old plans from time to time in the way a person might reference their youthful idealism. But the character who dominated the first 3 seasons, the one who made the audience slightly nervous because you could never quite be sure what he was going to say or build or attempt, was replaced by a warmer, softer, more emotionally accessible version. The new Stewie had genuine feelings. He was capable of real friendship, real vulnerability, real love in the case of his bond with Brian. He was in many ways a richer character than the one he replaced. But something that had been unique was gone. There is no other character in animated television who operated the way early Stewie operated, who occupied that specific space where sophisticated menace and infant helplessness intersected. The comedy that came from that gap was unlike anything else on the air, and once the writers decided the well was dry, they moved on without really trying to find out how deep it went. A hidden detail from the construction of the character that most viewers never knew. MacFarlane has said in interviews that the show's internal rules about who can hear Stewie were never fully settled. At various points in the show's run, the decision about whether other characters understood Stewie's dialogue was treated as a variable adjusted episode to episode based on what was most useful for the story being told. The general rule that emerged over time was that Brian always heard and understood Stewie. Chris sometimes could, and Peter, Lois, and Meg mostly did not. But this was not written policy. It was a working guideline, and it was broken whenever the writers needed it to be. MacFarlane compared this to the old Warner Brothers cartoons at a 2011 Comic-Con panel, specifically to Wile E. Coyote, noting that the rules of what any given animated character can and cannot do have always been somewhat fluid depending on what the scene requires. The adults treating Stewie as a normal, babbling infant while he delivers elaborate monologues was the original comedic premise, and it was strongest when maintained consistently. But consistency across 25 seasons of television is difficult, and the rule gradually became more porous. The 300th episode of the show, called Send In Stewie Please, which aired in 2018, addressed both of the character's great mysteries simultaneously, his voice and his sexuality. In the episode, Stewie has a session with a school psychologist voiced by Sir Ian McKellen, and during the session, he reveals that his British accent is not his real voice, that it is an affectation, a coat of armor he adopted to get through the day. He demonstrates his supposedly real voice, which sounds like a normal small child with a faint New England accent. McKellen's character tells him he cannot detect any difference. Stewie loses his composure entirely. The episode also brings Stewie to the verge of coming out during the therapy session, but stops short of a declaration, which was Gary Janetti's stated intention. The writer said in an interview with Entertainment Weekly that Stewie's sexuality was meant to remain in a state of perpetual ambiguity, and that the more interesting stories were found in the uncertainty rather than in any resolution. The episode ends with Stewie ensuring that the psychologist would not be in a position to tell anyone what had transpired during their session. Some things about this character, the episode suggested, were going to stay buried whether the audience wanted them to or not. Section 6. The episodes that could not be shown. There is something genuinely unusual about a television show that has produced episodes which exist, which are finished and fully animated and voice acted and scored, but which cannot be broadcast on their home network. It implies a specific kind of creative tension, a gap between what the people making the show believed was acceptable and what the people paying for it were willing to stand behind. Family Guy has lived in that gap more than once. The first episode to experience this kind of burial was When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, produced as part of the third season and intended to air in 2000. The episode features Peter Griffin having lost the family's savings through a series of poor decisions, developing the belief that he needs a Jewish person to help him manage his finances. He befriends a Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein, played by the actual Ben Stein, who helps him sort out his money problems. Peter then decides, through a chain of logic that tracks precisely along his usual cognitive style, that he should convert his son Chris to Judaism, so that Chris will have the same financial advantages that he incorrectly believes come automatically with Jewish identity. The episode is, in the way that early Family Guy often was, satirizing the anti-Semitic stereotype it is depicting rather than endorsing it. Peter's logic is presented as absurd. The humor comes from his misunderstanding rather than from the idea itself being validated. McFarlane's own politics, which have been consistently liberal throughout his career, made a sincere anti-Semitic episode essentially the impossible. But Fox executives, looking at the episode in 2000, decided that the line between satirizing a stereotype and perpetuating it was not clear enough for network broadcast. They held the episode, and it sat for 3 years. During that time, the show was canceled and then began its Adult Swim rerun life. Adult Swim broadcast When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. On November 9th, 2003, the same year the show was resurrected. It came out on DVD before that broadcast. Fox eventually aired it on December 10th, 2004. Before that Fox broadcast, McFarlane introduced the episode on Adult Swim with a joke about the network having decided that the episode was too risky. Where risky, he said, meant anything that did not feature Paris Hilton half naked on the hood of a car. The episode arrived late, slightly battered from its journey, but it arrived. The second buried episode has not arrived. Partial Terms of Endearment was written by Danny Smith and produced as the 21st episode of the 8th season, intended to air in spring 2010. The episode is about Lois agreeing to become a surrogate mother for an old college friend. The couple dies in a car accident while Lois is pregnant, leaving her in a situation where she must decide what to do with the pregnancy. The episode explores the abortion debate from multiple angles, gives voice to perspectives from both sides of the argument, and ends with Peter making a declaration about the outcome that breaks the fourth wall in a way that is fairly characteristic of the show's humor. McFarlane announced the episode at the 2009 San Diego Comic-Con, where he also revealed that Fox had told him why they would not air it. He expressed his belief that the decision was a product of the current environment's inability to handle difficult subjects being approached through comedy, and noted that he expected Fox would eventually come around, the way they had with the Weinstein episode. He was wrong about that. BBC Three in the United Kingdom aired the episode on June 20th, 2010, in its regular primetime slot. It was watched in just under 1 million homes. It received largely positive reviews. Critics praised the handling of a difficult subject and the show's willingness to not take an easy out at the end. Then it became available on the Season 8 DVD set in the United States. That is the only way American viewers can access it. Not on Hulu, not on Fox, not on Adult Swim. The DVD or the disc, or finding it in other ways, is all that exists. What makes Partial Terms of Endearment significant beyond its banned status is that it represents one of the clearest examples of the show doing exactly what it was theoretically designed to do, using humor as a way to approach a subject that drama cannot get close to without triggering defensive reactions. MacFarlane described it during the DVD commentary as the closest the show had come to doing a modern version of All in the Family, the 1970s sitcom that used domestic comedy as a vehicle for directly engaging with the most divisive social questions of its era. All in the Family aired things that seemed impossible for their time. Partial Terms of Endearment could not. There are other episodes in the show's history that have generated significant controversy without being fully pulled. Episodes that aired once and then were quietly difficult to find in reruns. Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, which aired in season 10, depicted an extended storyline about domestic violence involving the character Quagmire's sister. The episode showed graphic physical abuse in a level of detail that felt, to many viewers, less like satire and more like the show wallowing in something genuinely disturbing without sufficient purpose. The episode remained in the rotation but was rarely aired in reprises and generated sustained critical discussion about the line between addressing difficult subjects and exploiting them for shock value. Turban Cowboy, a season 11 episode, became controversial after the Boston Marathon bombing of April 15th, 2013. The episode, which had aired in March of that year, contained a scene depicting Peter Griffin inadvertently becoming involved in a bomb plot, along with a joke sequence in which Peter mows down a crowd of people while driving a car. The visual echo of the real attack, which used a pressure cooker device placed in a crowd, was close enough to make the episode deeply uncomfortable in retrospect. Fox and Hulu pulled the episode from their platforms in the days following the bombing. It later returned in a slightly edited form on some platforms, but remained a sensitive subject for years. The Boys in the Band, a season 18 episode, was pulled from Hulu and Fox's own platform in 2020 due to its use of blackface in a subplot involving Brian. The removal was part of a broader moment across entertainment media in which content featuring blackface was being re-examined and pulled, which also affected episodes of 30 Rock, Community, and other shows. Family Guy had actually addressed the blackface issue within the series earlier, in a season 5 episode called Peter's Two Dads, that explicitly criticized the practice. But the season 18 episode was removed regardless. The show has also been banned or edited in various countries for content that fell outside their regulatory or cultural standards. Venezuela banned the show in 2008 after a season 7 episode called 420, in which Brian leads a campaign to legalize marijuana in the fictional Rhode Island suburb. Venezuela's justice minister at the time cited the episode as promotion of drug use and warned cable stations in the country that they would face fines if they continued to broadcast the show. Family Guy was presented in official Venezuelan government statements as a vehicle for American cultural imperialism in the specific form of encouraging drug consumption. Russia banned Family Guy in 2011, following a complaint from a Russian citizen who objected to a scene in which Stewie watches a video of two men having sex. A court in Anapa ruled that the scene constituted the promotion of homosexual relations to minors, which was prohibited under Russian law. The ruling applied specifically to that episode, but effectively resulted in the show being pulled from Russian television entirely. There is a broader pattern visible in all of these removals, bangs, and hidden episodes. The show has always operated at the edge of what broadcast television is willing to put on the air, and it has sometimes crossed that edge in ways that had real consequences. Some of those crossings were deliberate, the result of creators who believed they had something worth saying and were willing to push through resistance to say it. Others were less deliberate, the result of shock value for its own sake, creating collateral damage that the creators had not fully anticipated. The vault is not empty. There are pieces of this show that most people will never see, buried in formats that are becoming harder to access, sitting in the space between what was made and what was allowed to be shown. And the strange thing is that knowing they are there, knowing the show pushed hard enough against its constraints that some of what it made got locked away, is part of what makes a show's history feel genuinely alive rather than simply like a long entertainment product doing what entertainment products do. Section 7: The Road Trips, the Vault episodes, and the Most Extraordinary Hour. There is a series of episodes within Family Guy's run that exist almost as a parallel show, a show within the show that operates by different rules, carries a different energy, and consistently produces the kind of television that makes people forget they are watching a late season episode of something that most critics have already written off. These are the road to episodes, and they represent the clearest proof that when the writers of this show cared enough to really commit to something, they could still make things that belonged alongside the best work of the early years. The concept originated with Seth MacFarlane's love of a specific series of Hollywood films from the 1940s. Bob Hope and Bing Crosby starred in a series of 7 comedy films released between 1940 and 1962, each titled Road to Somewhere, starting with Road to Singapore in 1940. These films had a very specific energy. Hope and Crosby played characters who were loosely constructed, who talked directly to the camera, who broke the fourth wall with a kind of casualness that suggested they knew perfectly well they were in a movie and found that fact amusing. They sang songs, they got into preposterous situations in exotic locations. The plots were minimal, almost vestigial, existing primarily as scaffolding for the banter and the musical numbers. MacFarlane loved them, and he wanted to make something that captured their spirit. The first Road to episode, Road to Rhode Island, aired on May 30th, 2000, during the second season. It was directed by Dan Povenmire, who would go on to create Phineas and Ferb, and written by Gary Janetti, who had been with the show since the beginning. In the episode, Brian volunteers to pick up Stewie from his grandparents' vacation home in Palm Springs, California, and manages to lose their plane tickets at an airport bar while in a state of considerable intoxication. The two of them have to make their way back to Rhode Island by whatever means present themselves, which includes stealing a car, crashing a plane, and riding in a freight train boxcar. The episode is remembered for several things. The musical number, a parody of the song Road to Morocco from the 1942 Hope Crosby film of the same name, performed by Brian and Stewie as they ride in the train boxcar, is one of the most beloved musical moments in the show's history. It sounds like something from old Hollywood, warm and slightly melancholy, and it arrives at the end of an episode that has also found time to show Brian confronting the stuffed remains of his mother at the puppy mill where he was born. The tonal range in that single episode, from slapstick absurdity to genuine emotional weight, is extraordinary. This episode also established something that would define the show's best work for the next decade. Brian and Stewie, placed together without the rest of the Griffin family, are genuinely interesting to watch. The early seasons had kept them in separate orbits, with Stewie mostly plotting against Lois and Brian mostly serving as Peter's voice of reason. Putting them on an adventure together revealed a dynamic that nobody had fully anticipated. An odd couple with genuine affection beneath the friction. An intellectual dog and a megalomaniacal baby who understood each other in ways that nobody else in either of their lives could. McFarlane had conceived the road to format from the beginning, but allowed it to develop organically. He told director Dan Povenmire during the production of the first Road to episode that there were 2 minutes to fill and that Povenmire should just do whatever he wanted with them. The freedom that McFarlane granted Povenmire in those early episodes produced some of the most inventive animation in the show's history. Povenmire later recalled that McFarlane's management style in those years was one of trusting people he believed in and getting out of the way, which allowed the people on the ground to bring their own ideas to the material. The Road to episodes have a different opening sequence, a different musical signature, custom title cards, and a generally elevated sense of production. They are the closest the show has to a prestige mode. The 7 Road to episodes that followed Road to Rhode Island took Brian and Stewie to Europe, to Germany in 1939 during the Nazi invasion of Poland, to multiple parallel universes via Stewie's multiverse remote, to the North Pole to rescue an exhausted Santa Claus, to Las Vegas via a malfunctioning teleportation device, and to India in search of a woman Brian had fallen in love with over the phone. Road to the Multiverse, the Season 8 premiere, is considered by many fans to be the finest episode of the show's revival era. It opens with Stewie revealing to Brian that he has constructed a remote control device that allows them to travel between parallel universes. What follows is a sequence of universe visits that showcase the best elements of the show's humor, wit, absurdity, and genuine creativity, operating at a high level without relying on the shock or the cruelty that had begun to appear more frequently elsewhere in the show. One of the universes is an alternate version of the fictional Rhode Island suburb, where humans are treated the way dogs are treated in the normal universe, and dogs have built human civilization. Brian and Stewie's roles reverse, and the sequence is both funny and surprisingly affecting. Another universe is a Disney animated version of the world, rendered in the style of classic Disney films, which required extensive additional animation work and pays off with a sequence that is genuinely beautiful. Road to the North Pole, the Season 9 Christmas special, is an hour-long episode that is remarkable for its willingness to go genuinely dark. Stewie and Brian travel to the North Pole to find Santa Claus, whom Stewie has decided to kill. What they find there is a Santa who is overwhelmed, depleted, running on exhaustion and desperation, a version of the Christmas mythology that has been worn down by the relentless scale of modern consumer demand. The episode swings between comedy and something that is almost genuinely sad in the final sequence, in which Brian and Stewie end up delivering gifts around the world themselves, is one of the most ambitious things the show ever attempted in terms of both animation and emotional range. But the most extraordinary hour of television the show ever produced was not a road to episode. It was a single location, 2-character episode from the 8th season called Brian and Stewie, which aired on May 2nd, 2010, and was the only episode in the show's history to contain no cutaway gags, no music, no supporting characters, and no resolution that left everything comfortably in place. The episode was written by Gary Janetti and directed by Dominic Bianchi. The premise is simple. Brian and Stewie get accidentally locked in a bank vault over a weekend. They have no way out and must simply be there with each other until the vault opens Monday morning. What happens in that vault over the course of a half-hour episode is the most direct exploration of who both characters actually are that the show ever attempted. Early in the episode, Stewie soils his diaper and has no way to address the situation. He asks Brian to help him. Brian is repulsed. They argue. Brian drinks a bottle of scotch from his safety deposit box. Stewie finds Brian's emergency phone and uses the only remaining charge to try to arrange an extension on a sweater return. They fight, they wound each other with their words, they reach the bottom of what they can say to each other in anger. And then, in the stillness that comes after that, Stewie asks about a gun that Brian has in his safety deposit box. Brian owns a gun, despite being an outspoken gun control advocate. He initially refuses to explain why. Under pressure, he admits that he keeps it in case he ever decides to end his own life. He has thought about suicide. He has come to the bank specifically because he wanted access to the gun and the bottle, his last drink and his exit point. He is not currently in crisis, but the gun exists because the possibility exists. Stewie's response to this information is one of the most quietly powerful moments in the show's history. He does not panic. He does not lecture Brian. He tells Brian, in his specific way, that he would be lost without him. Not in any kind of grand romantic or dramatic sense, but in the practical way that one person might tell another that they are genuinely necessary. Stewie, who began the series wanting to destroy his family and dominate the world, sits in a bank vault and tells a dog that he loves him and that it would be selfish to take away his one real friend. The episode ends the next morning with Brian carrying a sleeping Stewie out of the vault as it opens for the new day. No music, no cutaway, no reset. The things they said to each other happened. The gun is still in the box. The episode received enthusiastic reviews. MTV's Adam Rosenberg praised it for having a very thoughtful, mature discussion of suicide and what love means amidst it all. The Parents Television Council, which had spent years criticizing the show, called it, with what must have been some difficulty, genuinely excellent television. Even critics who had written the show off found something to praise. It was inspired, Gary Janetti has said in commentary, by an episode of All in the Family called Archie in the Cellar, in which Archie Bunker gets locked in his basement and spends a night alone with himself and his thoughts. McFarlane's framing of the episode as something that was like a one-act stage play captured exactly what it was. The show, when it chose to be, was capable of theater. Section 8. The secrets inside the animation. Most people who watch animated television shows do not think about how those shows are actually made. And this is understandable because the whole point of animation is to make the process invisible. You see the finished product. You see characters moving and speaking and making faces. You do not see the studios in Seoul and Glendale and other parts of the world where hundreds of animators spent thousands of hours translating storyboards into the images you are watching. But the production history of Family Guy is genuinely interesting, and some of it explains things about the show that have puzzled viewers for years. The first season of Family Guy was produced primarily by animation studios including Grimzam, Sunwoo Digital, and Wang Film Productions, all of which are South Korean studios. The practice of outsourcing animation production to South Korean studios was, by 1999, already standard practice in American television animation. The economics of animation production in the United States made it prohibitive to do everything domestically, and South Korean studios had developed deep expertise in producing quality animation at the volumes and speeds required for weekly television schedules. This is not a secret that the industry tried to hide, but it is also not something that was prominently advertised to viewers. The second and third seasons, which are generally considered to look the best of the original run, were handled primarily by Rough Draft Studios, which had two locations, one in Glendale, California, and one in Seoul, South Korea, operating as Rough Draft Korea. Rough Draft had been founded in a garage in Van Nuys, California in 1991 by Greg Vanzo and had grown into one of the most respected animation production companies in the industry, doing work for Futurama, The Simpsons, and numerous other major shows. The animation they produced for Family Guy in those seasons had a particular fluidity and expressiveness that is visible if you compare early episodes to later ones. The characters moved in a looser, more organic way. Their facial expressions had more range. The timing of physical gags was tighter. When the show returned from cancellation in 2005 for its fourth season, a different set of studios handled the work, and the result was animation that was cleaner, in some technical respects, but noticeably stiffer in terms of character movement. The outlines on the characters became slightly thicker. The movements became more restricted. The overall look was more polished in the way that digital production tends to produce polish, but it lost some of the handmade energy that the earlier seasons had. For seasons 6 and 7, the animation production shifted to a South Korean studio called Digital Emation, which continued to do significant portions of the show's animation into the later seasons. Some episodes from this period were also handled by a studio called Yedim, which used digital drawing tablets. The transition to more fully digital production methods changed the look of the show in ways that are subtle enough that casual viewers rarely notice, but that dedicated fans can identify almost immediately. The characters in later seasons have a slightly flatter quality to their movement, a kind of smoothness that is not quite the same as the organic flow of hand-drawn animation. Animation quality in comedy matters more than most people acknowledge, and this is worth thinking about carefully. The timing of a joke is not just about when a character delivers a line. It is about the movement of their face in the frames before and after the line. It is about the way their body responds to something happening around them. It is about the way a character falls when they fall, the way they flinch when they see something surprising, the way they hold themselves when they are trying to seem more dignified than they feel. All of these things are decisions that animators make, and the quality of those decisions determines whether a given joke lands or not. The best animation in the show's history, concentrated in those first few seasons, made the comedy feel alive in a way that later seasons could not always replicate. There are Easter eggs scattered throughout the show's animation history that dedicated frame-by-frame viewers have cataloged over the years. Some are intentional winks from the animation teams, small images or references hidden in backgrounds or for single frames. Some are what might be described as production accidents that became famous. In the first season episode Peter Peter Caviar Eater, a brief shot shows a version of the character Jesus Christ being crucified in the background of a crowd scene, drawn in a simple, almost comic strip style, visible for only a few frames before the camera moves on. Whether this was intended as a background joke or was included inadvertently has never been fully clarified by anyone who worked on the episode. The show's musical composition is another element that most viewers absorb without fully registering. Walter Murphy has served as the primary composer for most of the show's run, and he has given the show a musical language that is remarkably coherent across hundreds of episodes. Murphy's work draws on a wide range of styles, from jazz big band arrangements to classical parody to original song compositions that can land anywhere between genuine warmth and devastating irony depending on context. The opening theme is a standard musical theater construction, the kind of cheerful, professionally arranged number that says this is a show about a family in a way that the show itself then spends every episode subverting. The distance between the optimism of the theme and the content of the episodes is itself a running joke. One of the most interesting production details of the show is how it handles what are called table reads, the sessions where the cast gathers around a table and reads through a script together before recording begins. The table reads for animated shows are not quite the same as for live-action television, because the actors are not physically performing for the camera. But the table reads for Family Guy have reportedly produced a significant amount of material that never makes it into the final episode, improvisations and responses and tangents that the actors generate when they hear each other's lines. MacFarlane and Alex Borstein and Seth Green and Mike Henry together in a room reading a script has, by several accounts from writers on the show, always been a comedic event in itself. There are also the deleted scenes and cut content that have appeared on various DVD releases over the years. The show tends to produce more material than it can use in a 22-minute episode, and the sections that get cut are sometimes things that did not work and sometimes things that work too well in a particular direction that the episode could not follow all the way. Several DVD releases have included extended or alternate versions of scenes that show the show operating in registers that the broadcast cut does not quite reach. An alternate ending to a season 2 episode shows Stewie successfully assembling a weapon that the broadcast version cuts away from before completion. A deleted scene from the season 3 finale has Brian delivering a monologue about his relationship with Peter that is more openly emotional than anything in the broadcast version of that episode. The overseas production arrangement also meant that the show was, at any given time, being worked on simultaneously in multiple countries. A new episode would be written in California, storyboarded in California, and then shipped to South Korea for the actual animation work. The completed animation would come back to California for post-production, which included editing, sound mixing, voice recording synchronization, and music. The whole cycle took roughly 8 to 9 months per episode. This means that at any given point during the show's production, there were episodes in various stages of completion that were anywhere from a few weeks to several months away from broadcast. This long production pipeline has interesting implications. Jokes and references in an episode that airs in November of a given year were actually written approximately a year before that broadcast. The writer's room is always working in what amounts to a slightly different cultural moment than the one the audience is experiencing. This is why the show sometimes feels weirdly prescient and why it sometimes feels slightly behind the curve. By the time an episode referencing a current event arrives in homes, the event has often moved on in ways that the episode cannot account for. The production of the show's musical numbers, which have been a consistent element from the beginning, requires an additional layer of planning and execution. Every original song in the show goes through a composition process where a tune is written or selected, lyrics are crafted by the writers, the tune is arranged by Murphy or other composers. The voice actors record the song separately from the dialogue recording sessions, and the animation is then produced to sync with the recorded musical performance. This is a longer and more expensive process than standard dialogue production, which is part of why the show has always carefully selected which moments become full musical productions versus which ones are simply referenced in passing. The road to episodes, which feature the most elaborate musical content in the show, required significantly more production time and budget than standard episodes. This is part of why they could only appear a limited number of times per season. They were essentially mini productions within the production, requiring the involvement of orchestral musicians, the arrangement of complex musical numbers, and extended animation work to bring the sequences to life. Section 9. Brian Griffin and the Secrets of a Character Who Became Someone Else. In the earliest episodes of Family Guy, there's a scene in the second season episode, Road to Rhode Island, in which Brian sits at an airport bar and gets increasingly drunk while talking to a woman sitting next to him. He tells her with the kind of earnest confidence that only heavy drinking makes available, that she is getting more attractive with every passing minute. He loses their plane tickets. He causes a cascade of problems for both himself and Stewie. He is not admirable in this scene. He is weak and self-indulgent and a little embarrassing to watch. But the scene works because it is honest. This is a person we recognize. Someone who knows better and does it anyway, who has a complicated relationship with his own weakness, who will be mortified about this tomorrow morning, but right now does not quite care. That version of Brian, flawed and aware of his flaws, struggling with the gap between who he wanted to be and who he actually was, is one of the most genuine character constructions in the history of animated television. He was not a role model. He was not even particularly likable in some episodes, but he was real in the specific way that a certain kind of person is real to you when they remind you of someone you have actually known. Brian Griffin was, in those early seasons, a portrait of a specific type of failure that is more common than fiction usually acknowledges. The person who has genuine intelligence and genuine talent and genuine sensitivity, but who cannot quite find the channel to translate those things into a life that feels worthy of them. He was working on a novel. He had been working on it for years. He could not finish it. He drank too much. He fell for the wrong people. He had unrequited feelings for Lois that he kept mostly buried, but that surfaced occasionally in ways that were both touching and faintly inappropriate. He was Peter's best friend in the way that a person sometimes ends up being best friends with someone who is not quite their intellectual equal, but who offers something the intellectual needs, which is the warmth of uncomplicated loyalty. The voice, McFarlane's own natural speaking voice, was part of the character's emotional logic. When Brian spoke, you heard something that sounded like it came from a reasonable adult. The absurdity of his situation, a talking dog and a family of humans, was never foregrounded by the voice. The voice said, "This is a person," even when the visuals reminded you of what he actually was. The first sign that Brian was changing came in the revival seasons, when his political views, which had always been part of the character, began to take up more space. In the original run, Brian's liberalism was one ingredient in a complex recipe. After the revival, it started being the recipe itself. Entire scenes would be built around Brian delivering what amounted to op-ed pieces in dialogue form, statements about social policy and political figures that felt less like character revelation and more like the writers typing themselves into the show through a character they had decided could carry the weight of their opinions. This is a specific failure mode that long-running shows sometimes fall into, using a character who was originally rich and multidimensional as a mouthpiece, flattening them in the process. It is the opposite of Flanderization, in that instead of one trait expanding to fill the whole character, one trait from outside the character, the writer's viewpoint, displaces the traits that were already there. The season 9 episode Brian Writes a Bestseller is generally identified as the moment when Brian's trajectory became irreversible. In the episode, Stewie encourages Brian to begin writing again after years of creative stagnation. Brian writes a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It, which promptly becomes a massive bestseller, and then behaves towards Stewie with a contempt and cruelty that goes far beyond anything the early Brian was capable of. He dismisses Stewie, belittles him, treats the person who believed in him as though he is beneath notice. The character had become, in the language of the show's universe, exactly the kind of person he would have savaged in the early years when he was still functioning as a moral compass. The relationship between Brian and the character of Quagmire became one of the show's more interesting ongoing threads during this period, specifically because Quagmire served as the character who would say directly what many viewers were thinking. In the season 8 episode Jerome is the New Black, Quagmire delivers a speech to Brian that is essentially a prosecutorial summary of everything Brian has become. He accuses Brian of being a phony intellectual, of constantly pursuing Lois while living in her husband's house, of being a failed writer whose pretension exceeds his ability, of being a bad father who abandoned his own son. The speech is specific and accurate and delivered with the genuine anger that the show rarely allows its characters. What makes this scene interesting is not just its content, but its structural position in the show's history. The writers clearly knew that Brian had become a problem. They wrote a scene that acknowledged the problem directly, using another character as the vehicle. and then they did not fix the problem. The Quagmire speech became famous, appeared in countless online discussions about the show's character writing, and changed nothing about Brian's actual behavior in subsequent episodes. Brian died in the season 12 episode Life of Brian. He was hit by a car in a scene that was treated as genuinely serious. The show allowed the grief to breathe for a while. The family mourned. Stewie was devastated in a way that was deeply felt. A new dog named Vinny was brought in as a replacement. Fans were genuinely stunned, and many were genuinely upset, in the way that people sometimes are when something they grew up with disappears in a way they had not prepared for. 2 episodes later, in Christmas Guy, Stewie uses a stolen time device to go back to the moment of the accident and prevent it. Brian came back, the death was undone, everything reset. The reaction from critics and fans was overwhelming and predominantly negative, not because they were sad to see Brian back, but because of what the sequence revealed. The death had been used as a ratings mechanism. A show had killed one of its central characters, not because the story demanded it, but because the coverage and the social media conversation and the emotional response would drive viewership numbers during a specific ratings period. And then the show had reversed it almost immediately because it had no intention of maintaining the consequence. The death was a stunt. McFarlane and the producers were relatively open about this afterward, acknowledging that the decision had been controversial and that the resurrection was planned. From a certain business perspective, the logic is coherent. The death generated enormous coverage. The return generated enormous coverage. 2 rating season events for the price of one character decision. But from the perspective of the audience's relationship with the show, the event was corrosive. When you demonstrate to your audience that the show will undo anything that generates too much blowback, you teach them that caring about what happens is ultimately pointless. Brian's treatment of Stewie in the years after his return continued to deteriorate. In Brian the Closer, Quagmire, having previously helped Brian by paying for dental work after an injury, was repaid by Brian tricking him into purchasing a terrible property. In Boys and Squirrels, Brian killed a baby squirrel that Chris and Stewie had been attempting to protect, with no consequences. The specific moral geometry of these actions, taking from people who have helped you, hurting things that people you care about love, is genuinely disturbing in a way that the show seemed not to notice. There are still flashes, scattered through the later seasons, of the Brian that existed in the early years. Episodes where he shows genuine care for Stewie, where he acts selflessly, where the intelligence and the loyalty and the dry wit that made him worth watching are visible. The writers have not forgotten who he was. They occasionally remember it. But the character who emerged from the long middle stretch of the show's run, the pretentious, dishonest, casually cruel version of a character who had once been the show's moral center, is the version that most viewers who tuned in after season 5 would have known. And that version is genuinely difficult to like. Section 10. Meg Griffin, the character the show tried to erase. There is a specific kind of cruelty that masquerades as comedy by directing itself at a fixed target and increasing its intensity over time, betting that the audience will habituate to the cruelty and stop noticing what it is actually doing. Family Guy's treatment of Meg Griffin over roughly 10 seasons of its run is perhaps the most extended example of this in the history of network television, and it is worth examining carefully because what happened to this character says something true and uncomfortable about the relationship between comedy and power. In the first season of Family Guy, Meg Griffin was voiced by Lacey Chabert and was written as a specific kind of teenager that is genuinely recognizable from life. She was not popular. She was not cool. She existed in the orbit of a family full of extraordinary personalities, a reckless father, a competent mother, a genius baby, a talking dog, a sweetly strange brother. And by comparison, she seemed ordinary. The comedy that came from her was gentle. She was the kid who tried hard and got lukewarm results. She was the person in the room who nobody was quite addressing directly. This is a real experience that many people have, and the show captured it without malice. When Mila Kunis took over the role in season 2, she brought something to the character that MacFarlane has described as an authentic resentment, the quality of someone who has gotten used to being overlooked and is not entirely sure whether to be angry about it. Kunis was 15 at the time of her casting, which meant she was actually living something close to the experience she was voicing. The shift that began to happen around the 4th season was the change from Meg being ignored to Meg being actively despised. The jokes about her shifted from depicting the experience of being the least interesting person in a particular room to depicting something else entirely. A sustained campaign of contempt that escalated over the following years into territory that the show's own writers eventually acknowledged within episodes was abusive. Peter Griffin, who in the early seasons had been capable of genuine affection for his daughter, even through his general incompetence as a father, became the primary vehicle for this escalation. He began making comments about Meg's physical appearance in ways that were designed specifically to cause pain. He began physically pushing her, shoving her, treating her with a casual, physical contempt that went beyond cartoon slapstick into something more pointed. He forgot her existence on a regular basis in ways that were not played as the absent-mindedness of a generally ineffective person, but as active rejection. The flashback in which it is revealed that Peter and Lois attempted to abandon Meg at a fire station when she was an infant is one of the moments that crystallized for many viewers what the show had become. The humor in that scene is built entirely on the premise that parental rejection of an infant daughter is funny. Not satirically funny. Not funny in the complicated way that dark comedy sometimes earns its laughs. Just funny because Meg is being abandoned, and that is bad, and badness is funny when it happens to Meg. There is no architecture to the joke, no target being punctured, no truth being illuminated. The show found the thing that hurts most for a person to hear, that her parents tried to get rid of her before she could walk, and delivered it as a punchline. By the time you reach the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, the accumulated weight of everything that had been done to the character was enormous enough that the episode actually tried to address it. Meg finally confronts her family. She tells them in specific terms what they have done to her and what it has cost her. She calls Peter out for his cruelty, Lois for her enabling passivity, and the rest of the family for their participation in a sustained campaign against her well-being. The scene is, by the standards of what Family Guy usually allows itself to be, quietly extraordinary. It has real emotional weight. Mila Kunis delivers it with a control and a pain that makes the moment feel genuine. And then the show does the thing it always does. Meg takes it back. She goes to Brian and voluntarily withdraws her confrontation. She accepts that her role in the family is to be the target, because without a target, the family will turn on itself. The message of the episode's ending, which the writers may not have consciously intended but which is nonetheless there, is that the solution to surviving abuse is to embrace it. This ending generated significant critical response, including discussions about what the show was saying about domestic abuse, about the idea that victims should stay in their position because their departure would harm the people who hurt them. The episode is consistently ranked among the most controversial in the show's history, not because it was poorly made, but because of the specific moral position it chose to stake out. The broader arc of the show's treatment of Meg began to shift around seasons 14 and 15, partly through changes in the writing staff that brought more women into the room who pushed back against the steady cruelty. Meg began to get episodes where she was competent, capable, occasionally triumphant. She fought back against bullies. She demonstrated skills and qualities. The abuse began to soften, but for roughly 10 seasons, approximately 220 episodes, Meg Griffin had been used as a vessel for a specific kind of comedy that the show never fully reckoned with. She was the fixed target, the character about whom the joke was always the same, that she existed and people wished she did not. And the actress voicing her, Mila Kunis, became famous enough during those years that people would approach her in public and deliver the catchphrase of dismissal that Peter Griffin used on Meg, saying it to the real person as though the cruelty on the screen was something worth performing in real life. The irony that the show has occasionally acknowledged, always in the mode of a quick meta observation rather than a sustained reckoning, is that Meg is probably the most sympathetic character it has ever created. She wants to be loved. She wants to be seen. She wants her family to be proud of her and to acknowledge her presence and to treat her with something resembling the consideration that the rest of the family receives. These are the most basic human wants, and the show spent a decade punishing her for having them. Section 11. The Secrets of the Cutaway. The cutaway gag is the thing that Family Guy invented in its current form and that has been copied, parodied, praised, and attacked more than any other element of the show's comedy style. Understanding its history, its mechanics, and its evolution is essential to understanding both why the show worked and why its problems with overuse became structural rather than incidental. The cutaway gag, in its Family Guy form, works like this. A character makes a comparison or a reference. Something like, "This is worse than the time I did something specific." The screen transitions to a brief, self-contained scene depicting that something specific, which is often absurd, unexpected, and unrelated to the main plot. The scene plays out, usually for a few seconds. Then the show cuts back to the main story, which continues as though the cutaway never happened. The cutaway is, by design, parenthetical. It adds nothing to the plot and does not need to. Its job is to be funny in isolation. The cutaway format existed before Family Guy. Other sketch comedies and variety shows had used similar transitions. But MacFarlane and the original writing room developed the format into something more precise and more frequent than it had been anywhere else, and built it into the DNA of the show so thoroughly that it became one of the defining features of animated comedy in the early 2000s. In the first 3 seasons, the cutaways worked because of two qualities they consistently maintained. They were brief, usually lasting no more than 10 seconds, which meant they added to the episode without interrupting it. And they were genuinely tied to specific setups, written for the particular moment they were placed in, rather than being interchangeable. A joke in a season 1 episode about Peter's particular experience with a given situation was connected to something happening in that episode's story. The cutaway did not just demonstrate that Peter had done something funny in the past. It illuminated something about who he was or what was happening in the present moment. South Park, the long-running animated comedy, made this criticism explicitly in a 2006 two-part episode called Cartoon Wars. Creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone depicted the Family Guy writing process as a group of manatees pushing random idea balls together, suggesting that the comedy was essentially arbitrary, that any cutaway could replace any other cutaway because none of them connected to anything with actual meaning. Parker and Stone have been openly dismissive of Family Guy's writing for years, and they were open about the fact that those episodes were a direct attack. The episodes reportedly prompted phone calls to Parker and Stone from writers on The Simpsons and King of the Hill thanking them for making the observation. The extent to which the criticism was fair in 2006 is debatable. The extent to which it became fair in subsequent years is less debatable. The cutaways in the later seasons grew longer, grew more frequent, and began to take on the disconnected, interchangeable quality that Parker and Stone had described. An episode from season 15 might contain a dozen cutaways of varying lengths, with the main plot providing little more than the setup lines that trigger each gag. If you remove the cutaways from a typical later season episode, what remained would often be barely enough narrative to fill 10 minutes. The Conway Twitty gag, which appeared multiple times across the show's run, became the symbolic representation of this problem. In these segments, instead of an actual joke, the show would cut to a full, unedited performance of a Conway Twitty song, running for several minutes with no interruption. There was no punchline. The segment ended when the song ended and the show resumed. The first time this happened, it had a certain surprising humor to it. The sheer unexpectedness of a fully earnest country music performance replacing a comedy show's joke. By the third and fourth occurrence, it had become widely regarded as one of the laziest things ever broadcast on network television. The show was aware of the criticism. It made jokes about its own cutaway dependency in multiple episodes over the years. In the season 10 episode Back to the Pilot, Brian and Stewie travel back to the events of the first episode and observe characters standing in silence during a cutaway moment, waiting for it to end with nothing to do. The joke lands because the criticism is accurate. During cutaways, the story stops. The characters freeze. They have nothing to do except wait to resume being characters when the gag is over. Acknowledging this was funny and honest, but acknowledging a problem in a joke is not the same as solving it. There is an alternative version of what the show's relationship with cutaways could have been. And it is visible in the work of American Dad, which was created by MacFarlane alongside Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman and premiered in 2005. American Dad does not use cutaway gags. The show must construct all of its comedy from within the episode's actual plots, which means every joke has to earn itself through character and situation, rather than by pausing the narrative for a standalone bit. The result over time was a show that developed stronger storytelling muscles, characters that grew more complex because they had to carry the weight of the comedy themselves, and plots that were more satisfying as complete units because nothing was borrowed from outside. The contrast between the two shows, running simultaneously for nearly 2 decades, is one of the clearest natural experiments in the history of animated television. Same creator, same network, same general sensibility, fundamentally different relationship with narrative economy. One show trusted the cutaway. One show did not. The show that did not, American Dad, is now widely regarded as the better show, which would have seemed like an impossible statement to anyone watching the Sunday Night Fox lineup in 2005. Section 12. Seth MacFarlane steps away, and what happens next? There's a pattern that runs through the history of long-running television shows, a pattern that is clear enough in retrospect, but almost invisible while it is happening. The person who created the show is also the person who understands it best, who has the deepest intuition for where the humor lives, and where the line is, and what the characters can sustain. When that person steps back, something specific is lost, not the talent of the remaining crew, but the irreplaceable thing that comes from being the origin of something. Seth MacFarlane began stepping away from active day-to-day creative involvement in Family Guy around 2011. He did not quit. He continued to voice all 4 of his characters for every episode. His name remained on the credits as creator, but the writing, the story planning, the decisions about where the show was headed, and what the characters would do, those responsibilities passed to other people. The show-running duties were taken over by Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, both of whom had been with the show for years and knew its world thoroughly. What Appel and Sulkin knew was not quite the same as what MacFarlane knew, and this is not a criticism of their abilities. They were competent, dedicated professionals who had invested significant portions of their careers in the show. But there's a difference between knowing a show and being the generative source of it. MacFarlane had the specific intuition that comes from having invented the characters, from having made the first jokes, from having tested the original audience, from knowing in his body rather than in his head where the edge of the territory was. The showrunners who inherited his position had a map. MacFarlane had built the terrain. The projects MacFarlane moved toward during this period were ambitious and largely successful on their own terms. The 2012 film Ted, which he wrote, directed, produced, and starred in as the voice of a teddy bear brought to life, grossed more than $500 million worldwide and earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Song. He followed it with the 2014 Western comedy A Million Ways to Die in the West, also written, directed, and starring him. Ted 2 came in 2015. The Orville, a science fiction series that MacFarlane created, starred in, wrote, and produced, premiered on Fox in 2017, and eventually moved to Hulu, where it found a devoted audience. He produced a prequel series to Ted for Peacock that launched in 2024. He released multiple albums of jazz and big band music, a passion that had been visible in the show's musical episodes for years. MacFarlane is, by any measure, one of the most productive creative entities in American entertainment. The scope of his output across a career that has now spanned 30 years is genuinely extraordinary. But Family Guy, which had launched all of that, had ceased to be the place where his energy was going. His public statements about the show in this period are revealing. In a 2021 social media post, he expressed frustration about the show's relationship with Fox, saying that Tucker Carlson's commentary on Fox News made him wish the show was on any other network. He compared his relationship with the network to a failing marriage. In 2020, he signed a deal with NBC Universal worth approximately $200 million over 5 years, moving his production company away from Fox and into the Comcast ecosystem. His newer projects were being made for platforms entirely separate from the network where Family Guy continued to air. In 2024, MacFarlane gave an interview in which he was asked about the future of the show. His response was notable for its absence of creative passion. He said he did not see a good reason to stop making it, because people still loved it and it made them happy, and because the revenue it generated helped fund environmental conservation causes he supported through organizations like Rainforest Trust. He described the show as having reached what he called escape velocity, meaning it had been running long enough that there was no logical point at which it made sense to stop. He framed its continued existence in terms of financial utility and audience retention rather than creative necessity. This is an honest and reasonable position for a person to take about a project they have been working on for a quarter century. It is also a very different position from the person who spent 6 months drawing in his kitchen to create the original pilot. That person had something to say and was racing to find the forum that could say it. The person speaking in 2024 was describing a machine that continued to run because stopping it would require more effort than keeping it going, and the revenue justified the effort. In April 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had been renewed for 4 additional seasons, taking the show through the 2028 to 2029 television season and coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season would consist of 15 episodes. The deal was struck with the show's parent company, Disney, which had acquired the Fox Entertainment assets in 2019. Family Guy was not being canceled. It was being guaranteed. It was being locked in place for years into the future, not because its creator was hungry to tell specific stories, but because it was cheaper to produce than live-action television, had enormous value in streaming and syndication, generated reliable merchandise revenue, and represented a brand that could be marketed globally with minimal additional investment. The show moved from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights during the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, the first time it had aired on a weekday since 2002, the year of its first cancellation. This was widely understood within the television industry as a demotion. a signal that the network was no longer treating the show as a flagship property and was moving it to a quieter night with lower expectations. The show that had once been the centerpiece of Fox's Sunday animation lineup, the show that had earned a Primetime Emmy nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series in 2009, the first animated series to receive that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961, was now filling a Wednesday night slot. The ratings told the same story. Season 4, the revival season, had averaged around 7.9 million viewers. Season 13 averaged 5.86 million. Season 20 averaged 1.31 million. Season 23 averaged 723,000 viewers. The show that had premiered to 22 million viewers after Super Bowl 33 was being watched by fewer people than lived in certain mid-sized American cities. And yet the show continued. The machine kept running. The contracts were signed. The episodes were written. The animation was produced in Seoul and assembled in California, and broadcast to an audience that was small by historical standards, but still real, still there, still finding something in a late Wednesday night episode of a show that had been on the air since 1999. Section 13. American Dad, The Parallel Universe. The most useful thing you can say about American Dad in the context of Family Guy's history is that it exists, that it was created by the same person, at the same time, for the same network, and that it took a fundamentally different set of creative decisions and arrived, over time, at a fundamentally different destination. The comparison matters not because American Dad is perfect, but because its existence makes the argument that long-running shows inevitably decline seem demonstrably false. American Dad premiered on February 6, 2005, a few months before Family Guy returned from cancellation with its fourth season. It was created by MacFarlane in collaboration with two writers who had been central to the early Family Guy writing room, Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman. The show followed Stan Smith, a patriotic, socially conservative CIA agent living in Langley Falls, Virginia, with his wife Francine, their college-aged daughter Haley, their high school-aged son Steve, a space alien named Roger who lived in their attic, and a goldfish named Klaus, who was actually a German man whose brain had been transferred into a fish's body by the CIA. The supporting cast included creatures and premises that were, on paper, weirder than anything in Family Guy. A shape-shifting alien, a talking fish with existential concerns about his own identity. In its first season, American Dad was not particularly well received. The political humor was broad. Stan's conservatism was depicted in ways that felt one-dimensional. And the show seemed to be straining to establish a voice that was not simply Family Guy with different character names. Critics were lukewarm. Ratings were decent, but not spectacular, benefiting heavily from the Family Guy slot directly preceding it on Sunday nights. Nobody was claiming that American Dad was exceptional. It was regarded as a secondary product. Then something happened that is rare and worth paying close attention to when it occurs. The show got better, not marginally better, substantially, consistently, measurably better over consecutive seasons, as the writers found the things the show could do that Family Guy could not. The first fundamental difference was the absence of cutaway gags. Without the ability to pause the narrative for disconnected jokes, the writers of American Dad had to make every episode work as a coherent story. This forced a discipline that produced better storytelling over time. Characters had to develop, relationships had to deepen, plots had to resolve in ways that felt earned rather than abandoned. The comedy had to come from within the situations rather than being imported from outside. Stan Smith, who began as a political caricature, became, over several seasons, one of the more interesting figures in animated television. He was wrong about things in specific, identifiable ways. He was stubborn and often harmful. But he loved his family in ways that were visible and genuine, and the show was willing to let him grow, to let the situations he created have actual consequences for who he was. Contrast this with Peter Griffin, whose journey in the same period moved in the opposite direction, becoming less nuanced, more extreme, less capable of growth. Roger the Alien became what many critics have identified as the most creative, recurring character in adult animation. His ability to adopt completely different personas, to become entirely new characters with new names and new histories and new personalities, gave the writers an infinite creative resource. Every episode could feature a new Roger, each one more elaborately constructed than the last. None of them ever became the whole character because the whole character was the one underneath, the alien in the attic who could become anyone. The concept was designed to be inexhaustible in a way that the evil genius baby was not. The show moved from Fox to TBS after its 11th season, a network transition that could have been the beginning of the end. Instead, freed from the constraints of Fox's standards and operating under a cable network with different expectations and different flexibility, American Dad continued to produce quality television. The move was widely described at the time as a demotion, a show being relegated to a lesser platform. But the quality of the work that emerged afterwards suggested that the new environment suited the show better than the old one had. The irony of the American Dad situation is multi-layered. MacFarlane was, by his own account, less directly involved in American Dad on a day-to-day basis than he was in Family Guy during the early years of both shows. Yet American Dad maintained its quality while Family Guy declined. This seems to contradict the argument that MacFarlane's reduced involvement was the primary cause of Family Guy's problems. And in a sense, it does. The real argument is not simply that MacFarlane left and things got worse. The real argument is that the choices made by the people who ran the shows in his relative absence were different, and those different choices produced different outcomes. The American Dad writing staff, led for many years by Weitzman and later by showrunner Brian Boyle, made choices that protected the show's identity. They did not use cheap tricks. They did not rely on shock value as a primary comedy tool. They did not systematically degrade their characters for short-term laughs. They allowed the show to be strange and specific and occasionally experimental in ways that required patience from the audience. The patience was rewarded. The Family Guy writing staff made different choices. Not because they were less talented, not because they did not care about the show, but because the incentive structures and the creative habits they had developed around cutaways, around shock value, around the specific well of character cruelty that the show had learned to draw from, pointed them in a different direction, and the show went where it was pointed. Section 14. The Legacy and the Things That Remain. There's a scene in the first season episode, Death Has a Shadow, that most people who have been watching Family Guy for years have seen, but probably do not consciously remember, because it is quiet and brief and happens in the middle of a plot about Peter accidentally becoming wealthy from unemployment fraud. Peter and Lois are standing in the kitchen. They have had a fight. They are tired, the way people who love each other and have been fighting get tired. Not because they have stopped caring, but because caring about something is exhausting. And Peter says he is sorry. He says it simply, without comedy, without a cutaway to soften it. He looks at his wife and tells her he was wrong, and she looks back at him, and there's a moment where two people in a cartoon are just two people. That is the thing that the earliest seasons of the show could do, that the later seasons could not quite maintain. It could be funny, and then, in the next moment, be something else. It could hold the absurdity and the sincerity at the same time, without the sincerity feeling like a joke and without the absurdity undercutting the emotion. The Griffins were a chaotic family who loved each other beneath the chaos, and you could feel that. You could feel it in the way Peter apologized and the way Lois waited for him to, in the specific texture of a relationship that had wear on it but had not worn through. The show at its best was about the gap between what people are and what they wish they were, which is a theme that comedy and tragedy have shared for as long as humans have been making both. Peter Griffin was not smart enough to be the father he wanted to be. Brian Griffin was not talented enough to be the writer he believed himself to be. Stewie was not old enough to be the conqueror he felt himself to be. Meg was not lucky enough to be the loved person she needed to be. These gaps were funny. These gaps, they were also real. And the show, for a few seasons, understood that the funniness and the realness were the same thing seen from different angles. The decline, as has been traced through the preceding sections of this journey, came from choices that prioritized one element of this equation at the expense of the other. As the cruelty increased, the realness became less real. As the cutaways proliferated, the funniness became less connected to anything human. As the characters drifted toward their most extreme versions of themselves, the gaps that had generated comedy became chasms that generated discomfort. The show that exists today on Wednesday nights, watched by a fraction of its former audience, is still making things. Episodes are still produced. The voice cast still records. McFarlane still voices four characters. Mila Kunis still voices a Meg, who has been treated substantially better in recent seasons than she was for the decade before. There are moments in recent seasons that are as genuinely funny as anything the show has ever done, which is itself a testament to something. The talent never left. The ability to produce a brilliant 10 seconds of television never disappeared. What disappeared was the consistent connective tissue that made those 10 seconds feel like part of something larger and more meaningful. The history of this show is the history of what happens when a very specific creative vision is subjected to the pressures of long-form commercial entertainment. When the human beings who built something have to keep building it long after the original impulse has been satisfied. It is not a story that ends in failure. The show has not failed. It has survived more challenges than almost any television show in history, including 2 cancellations and a revival and a writer's strike and a 9/11 near miss by its creator, and a death and resurrection of its second most important character, and a move from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights, and a transition from Fox's flagship animation to Disney's ongoing concern. What the show has lost is harder to name than what it has kept. It has lost the warmth that made the chaos bearable. It has lost the sense that the people inside the story mattered to the people making it. It has lost the quiet moments between the loud ones, the brief seconds when the show would stop performing and simply be present with its characters, the way a person is sometimes present with someone they love. Not doing anything, just being there. The version of that Peter and Lois kitchen scene from the first episode, played in the mind while falling asleep, carries a particular quality that is different from almost anything the show produced in its later decades. It is simple. It is a little embarrassing. And somehow, in the way that the things you watch when you are young and tired tend to feel, it feels like something that happened in a place you know, in a house that was real, at a time that was real, between people who were real in the specific way that animated people become real. When the writing is honest enough, and the voices are right, and the moment is allowed to just be what it is, without anything around it, demanding that it become something else. That is the secret the show has always been keeping, even when it was not keeping it well. That beneath the cutaways and the cruelty and the shock and the controversy and the viewer counts and the network politics and the DVD sales and the Adult Swim ratings and the revival and the Wednesday nights, there was always, somewhere in the original sketch, a person trying to make something real about what families are, about what it costs to love people who drive you crazy, about what it means to be the least interesting person in a room and to want more than that, about what it is to be a dog who wants to be a writer, and a baby who wants to conquer the world, and a man who never quite outgrows the boy he was. The secrets have been told. The story is as complete as it can be made tonight. And whatever corner of the world you're in, whatever hour it is where you are, whatever brought you to this particular place at this particular moment, there is something slightly strange and slightly wonderful about the fact that a show that was canceled twice, that was buried and retrieved and canceled again and retrieved again, that was built in a kitchen by a 24-year-old who used to sell comics to his neighbors for $1.50, has been part of the soundtrack of this many people's lives for this many years. That is what survives. Even the things that did not last left something behind. If you are still with us, genuinely from the bottom of the channel, thank you. These stories took a long time to put together, and it means everything that you stayed for all of them. If you found anything in here that surprised you, or that you will remember the next time you catch a rerun on a quiet night, we would love to know about it in the comments. Tell us your favorite secret from tonight. Tell us what surprised you most. Tell us what you already knew that we covered. If you have not already subscribed, now is a wonderful moment to do that. It is free, it takes a second, and it is the single most useful thing you can do for a channel like this one. Every subscriber matters more than you probably realize. Every notification you leave on is one more night that we get to come back and do this again. Stay comfortable. Stay warm. We will see you in the next one. Section 15. The chicken fights and the recurring mythology. There is a specific element of Family Guy's visual comedy that stands apart from the cutaway gags and the dialogue-driven humor. Something that the show invented essentially whole cloth, and that no other show on television has ever quite replicated in the same way. These are the fights between Peter Griffin and a giant chicken named Ernie the Giant Chicken, and they are one of the most genuinely strange and genuinely funny recurring elements in the show's history. The first chicken fight appeared in the second season episode, Da Boom, which aired on December 26, 1999. Peter receives a coupon from a giant chicken on the street, but the coupon turns out to be expired. He argues with the chicken. They fight. What begins as a mild altercation escalates into a brawl that spans multiple city blocks, involves buildings being destroyed, cars being totaled, and both combatants sustaining injuries that would hospitalize any real person. The fight goes on for roughly 3 minutes, which is an enormous amount of screen time in a 22-minute episode. It ends, the story resumes, and the chicken is not mentioned again. This joke, which should have been a one-time absurdity, became a recurring event, returning at unexpected intervals in later seasons, each time escalating the scale of destruction and the duration of the fight. The second chicken fight in the Season 4 episode, The Chicken Ripple, runs even longer than the first. The third in the Season 6 episode, No Meals on Wheels, introduces Ernie the Giant Chicken's wife and family, adding a domestic layer to the mythology. By the time the fourth chicken fight arrived in Season 8, the episode essentially abandoned all other storylines to devote its runtime to an extended battle that ends with Peter and Ernie apparently reconciling, drinking together, and then resuming the fight because old habits die hard. The chicken fights work for a specific reason that is worth understanding. They are commitment jokes. The humor is not in the concept itself, which is simple. A man is fighting a giant chicken because of an expired coupon. The humor is in the show's absolute refusal to acknowledge that this is unusual, combined with its willingness to let the joke run far longer than any joke in a comedy show should run. They are the anti-cutaway, in a sense. The cutaway gag gets in and gets out before the audience has time to stop finding it funny. The chicken fight stays long after the audience has had time to stop finding it funny, and then keep staying until the sheer duration of the commitment produces a different kind of comedy, the humor of excess, of things that have gone on so long that stopping would itself be a kind of failure. The fights also serve as a pressure release valve in episodes that are sometimes dealing with more emotionally complex material. An episode in which Peter and Lois are having serious marital problems can contain a 3-minute fight with a giant chicken in the middle act. And the transition between the two modes is so abrupt and so complete that it functions almost like a palate cleanser. The show understood that extremes placed next to each other without transition create a particular kind of comedy energy, and the chicken fights were one of the most reliable tools for generating that energy. What most viewers never knew about the chicken fights is that they were, in production terms, among the most expensive sequences in the show to animate. The kinetic complexity of two large bodies fighting across multiple environments, with realistic physical interactions and detailed destruction, required significantly more work than a standard dialogue scene. The production team at various points discussed whether the cost justified the runtime, and the conclusion they kept reaching was that they did, because the chicken fights were one of the things that generated the most consistent fan enthusiasm and the most memorable moments in a given episode. In 2022, it was confirmed that Ernie the Giant Chicken would not appear in future episodes of the show. The character's voice actor had passed away, and the show made the decision not to recast the role, which is one of the more genuinely touching choices the production has made in recent years. The chicken fights, which had been a fixture since 1999, were over. The episodes that contain them remain in syndication and on streaming services, and they are still genuinely funny, which is the highest praise you can give any joke in any show. But no new ones will be made. Section 16. The Peter voice, the security guard, and the accidental creation. There's a story within the story of how Peter Griffin's voice came to be that is so specific and so accidental that it deserves its own space to breathe. McFarlane has told the version that appears in most biographies and profiles, the one about a security guard he overheard while attending RISD. But the full texture of that story, and what it means Akaye for how the show's central character came to exist, is richer than the summary version captures. McFarlane was a student at a place that has a particular kind of physical geography. The Rhode Island School of Design is embedded in the city of Providence. Its buildings interspersed with residential streets and commercial areas in a way that is not like a traditional campus with clear boundaries. Students move through the neighborhood. They walk past buildings they are not part of. They hear conversations they are not meant to hear. Voices carrying through half-open windows, through walls that were not designed to be soundproof. The security guard whose voice McFarlane heard was working at a building connected to the school. McFarlane overheard the man through a window or a partition, speaking to someone else. The voice had specific qualities, a particular flatness of effect, a slightly nasal quality, a working-class New England regional accent that carried the rhythms of a specific kind of American speech that has been slowly homogenized out of existence by decades of mass media and interstate migration. This was a voice that belonged to a place and a time that carried the geographic specificity of a certain kind of Rhode Island working-class experience, and McFarlane heard it and stored it. He used the voice first for Larry in The Life of Larry, the thesis film. The voice was already there before the show existed. When the show was greenlit and he was building Peter Griffin from the materials he had accumulated, the voice came along. The security guard at RISD, a person whose name is not publicly recorded and who probably never knew that his way of speaking would be heard by hundreds of millions of people over the next 25 years, became the vocal foundation of one of the most recognizable characters in the history of American entertainment. McFarlane has been thoughtful in interviews about what Peter's voice communicates beyond its surface comedy. There's something in the flatness of it, in the slightly monotone quality, that suggests a person who is not quite registering the full weight of most of what happens around him. Not because he is cruel in the early seasons, but because he does not quite have the cognitive bandwidth. The voice is the sound of someone who is always slightly behind, always catching up to what just happened, processing the world with a small but meaningful delay. It is a kind voice in the early seasons, despite being a kind of comic voice. It does not carry malice. It carries a kind of exhausted good cheer. As Peter's character became meaner in the later seasons, the voice itself remained the same, which created an interesting dissonance. The voice still sounds like the working class New Englander who means well and is doing his best. The actions attached to that voice in the post season 7 era are the actions of someone who does not care about anyone but himself. The gap between the sound and the behavior is part of what makes Peter in the later seasons so uncomfortable to watch. The voice is still asking for affection. The character is no longer particularly deserving of it. The full voice cast of the show represents, in aggregate, one of the most extraordinary assemblages of vocal talent in the history of animated television. McFarlane alone voices more than 700 distinct characters across the show's run. According to some estimates, though the vast majority of these are brief appearances that required only a few lines. The four main characters he voices permanently occupy different registers of his range, different aspects of his personality and his vocal skill, and keeping all four distinct through thousands of recording sessions over more than 2 decades represents a technical achievement that is rarely discussed, but is genuinely remarkable. The recording sessions themselves have changed over the years as the show has evolved. In the early seasons, the small writing staff and the close relationships between the cast members meant that recording sessions sometimes had an improvisational quality, with actors playing off each other and finding moments that the scripts had not anticipated. In the later seasons, with a larger production operation and more rigid schedules, the recordings became more procedurally efficient and less exploratory. The difference between an early season performance and a late season performance is partly writing, and partly this shift in the recording environment. The difference between people making something together and people delivering a service. Section 17. The show that predicted what it should not have known. The subject of Family Guy and prediction is one that requires careful handling because the internet's enthusiasm for finding examples of shows that predicted future events tends to collapse the distinction between coincidence, cultural pattern recognition, and genuine foresight. The show has been on the air since 1999. It has produced hundreds of hours of content. In that volume of material, referencing virtually every aspect of contemporary American culture, some things will inevitably echo events that happen later. This is not supernatural, it is probability. And yet there are specific examples in the show's history that are harder to dismiss than the average coincidence. And they are worth examining carefully because they reveal something true about the show's relationship with American culture, which was always more attentive than it appeared. The Osama bin Laden airport scene in Road to Rhode Island, produced and aired in 2000, depicted bin Laden at an airport singing a song from a chorus line as a distraction, while weapons passed through security scanners. This joke was written more than a year before the September 11th attacks. The production team has noted, in various commentaries and interviews, that bin Laden was already a known figure of concern in 2000. Not a household name, but a person who had been on the CIA's radar for years, following the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the 1998 embassy bombings in Africa. The joke was not random. It was drawing on existing knowledge and cultural anxiety. But the specific visual of bin Laden in an airport, in a scenario involving weapons and security, is uncomfortable to watch now in a way that it was not when it first aired. The scene was cut from subsequent airings of the episode after September 11th. It was removed from at least one DVD release in the United States. The existence of the scene and the fact of its removal became themselves a subject of media coverage in the weeks following the attacks. There are other examples that circulate in fan communities. An episode from the first season contained a visual joke that bears a superficial resemblance to an event that would happen years later. The show also made a joke about a specific medical device being used for something it was not intended for, years before a news story about exactly that situation. Some of these examples are genuinely striking. Some of them are the result of retroactive pattern matching, where the brain finds similarities that did not exist in the original intent. What is genuinely true and worth emphasizing over the more dramatic coincidence examples is that the show has consistently demonstrated a sensitivity to where American culture was headed, to the anxieties and preoccupations and fault lines that were developing beneath the surface of public life. McFarlane and the writers who have worked on the show over the years have generally been people who read widely, who paid attention to news and culture, who were interested in the texture of contemporary American life in ways that most entertainment products or sauce blanche are not. The show has made jokes about political figures and social trends and cultural developments that felt prescient because they were built on careful observation rather than on pure randomness. There is also the question of what the show failed to predict, which is equally instructive. The show has been wrong about technology, about social movements, about where entertainment would go, about which cultural figures would endure and which would fade. Its relationship with the future is not that of an oracle, but of a very attentive present-day observer, someone who is paying close enough attention that they occasionally get something right by accident, and occasionally get things right because the pattern was visible to anyone who was looking carefully enough. Section 18. The Writer's Room and the Culture Inside It. The story of any long-running television show is, at its core, a story about the people who are in a room together, every week, trying to make something funny. The writer's room is where the show lives or dies, and the culture of a writer's room, who is in it, how they treat each other, what they are allowed to say and to advocate for, shapes everything that eventually makes it to air. Family Guy's writer's room in the early years was relatively small. McFarlane assembled people he trusted, many of whom he had known before the show began. The writers he gathered in those first seasons were, by multiple accounts from people who were there, a genuine creative community with a shared sensibility and enough mutual respect to push each other. They disagreed. They argued about jokes and about character motivations and about whether a specific episode was good enough to air. But the arguments were productive because they were happening between people who shared the same fundamental understanding of what the show was supposed to be. As the show expanded through the revival period and into its later seasons, the writer's room grew larger and its culture became more complicated. More people meant more perspectives, which was sometimes genuinely good for the work and sometimes genuinely problematic. The show has been criticized in various quarters for specific kinds of humor that reflect specific blind spots in its writing culture, blind spots that tend to be visible when a room lacks sufficient diversity of experience among the people making creative decisions. The treatment of Meg Griffin, discussed at length in an earlier section, is one of the most visible products of a specific kind of writer's room culture. The character became a target for reasons that are partly creative laziness, the comfort of a reliable punch-down joke, and partly something more troubling, the tendency of any creative environment to normalize specific kinds of cruelty when that cruelty generates reliable audience response. The people making the show were not, by most accounts, malicious individuals, but they were people working in a specific environment with specific incentive structures, and those environments and structures produce specific kinds of output. The addition of more women to the writing staff in the show's later seasons has been credited by multiple people involved with the production, with the gradual shift away from the sustained meg abuse that characterized the middle seasons. This is not a revolutionary claim. It is simply the documented result of a creative environment changing its composition and finding that the new composition produced different choices. The Meg storylines after season 14 are different from the Meg storylines before it. The change in the room was one of the causes. The show has also had a complicated relationship with the question of who speaks for the experience of minority communities in its humor. The show's relationship with race in particular has been a subject of sustained critical discussion for as long as it has been on the air. MacFarlane has defended specific content on the grounds of satire and the tradition of comedy as a venue for addressing what polite discourse avoids. Critics have argued that the satire defense requires a level of execution that the show does not always achieve, that pointing at a stereotype and labeling the pointing as commentary is not sufficient to make the pointing worthwhile. These are complicated conversations that do not have clean resolutions, and they are not unique to Family Guy. They run through the history of provocative comedy in American entertainment. What makes Family Guy a particularly significant case study is the scale and duration of its reach. The show has been watched by a genuinely enormous number of people over a genuinely long stretch of time. The content it puts in front of those people and the culture it reflects and reinforces in the process matters in ways that a smaller or shorter-lived show's content does not. Section 19, the music and the things it carries. One of the aspects of Family Guy that is least discussed in critical writing about the show, but most directly felt by the people who watch it, is the music. Not the famous theme song, which gets plenty of attention, and not the occasional Broadway-style production numbers that arrive in specific episodes, but the background score, the continuous musical texture that runs beneath the dialogue and the action, telling you how to feel about what you are watching, even when you are not consciously listening to it. Walter Murphy has been the show's primary composer for most of its run, and his work is one of the most sophisticated long-form musical projects in the history of television animation. The score of Family Guy is not a single sound. It is a vocabulary, a set of musical gestures that have accumulated meaning through years of repetition and context. A specific chord progression tells you that something uncomfortably sad is about to be played for comedy. A particular orchestral swell signals that someone is about to do something foolish on a grand scale. A quiet, slightly melancholy acoustic figure appears when the show briefly allows itself to be sincere. Murphy's background in jazz and pop composition is audible throughout the score, which tends to be harmonically more sophisticated than what you might expect from an animated comedy. The show has at various points used jazz trio arrangements for comedic dialogue sequences, string quartet figures for ironically pompous moments, and full orchestral arrangements for parody sequences. The range is enormous, and maintaining that range consistently across hundreds of episodes represents a compositional achievement that is almost never acknowledged in discussions of what makes the show work. The original songs, which appear in Road to Episodes and in various standalone musical numbers throughout the show's history, have their own layer of secret history. Many of the songs were written or co-written by MacFarlane himself, who has genuine compositional ability and a deep knowledge of American popular music from the mid-20th century. The big band and jazz standards that he has released on multiple commercial albums are not a side project separate from the show. They are an expression of the same musical sensibility that produced the show's scores and musical numbers. When Stewie and Brian sing together in the train boxcar at the end of Road to Rhode Island, the warmth and melancholy of that number is not accidental. It comes from a person who genuinely loves that kind of music and knows how to write it. The show has also made extended use of copyrighted existing music, both as source music and scenes and as the basis for parody songs. The legal landscape around music parody is specific and well established in American law, and the show has generally navigated it successfully, but there have been complications. The When You Wish Upon a Weinstein episode contained a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star that generated a lawsuit from the song's publisher. Fox won the case in 2009. The process of securing clearances for musical references and the creative decisions about when to pay for a license versus when to create an original work is an ongoing part of the show's production that most viewers never see but that shapes what music they hear in any given episode. Section 20. What remains when the lights go down? It is late now, or early, depending on where you are and what brought you to this. The room has gotten quieter, or you have found a comfortable position, or the light has changed in a way that makes everything feel slightly further away than it was when we started. This is the place this kind of storytelling is built for. The space between wakefulness and sleep, where things can be heard differently than they can be heard in the full brightness of the day. What we have covered tonight is, in the truest sense, the hidden architecture of something that was always visible. The show was always there to watch, but the story underneath the show, the young man drawing in his kitchen for 6 months, the security guard whose voice became a character, the professor who submitted a thesis film to an animation studio without the student's knowledge and changed everything, the 3-year gap and the Adult Swim reruns and the DVD sales and the phone call from Fox saying, "Come back," the flight that did not board, and the vault that would not open, and the band that never lifted. All of that was always there too, running parallel to the episodes, invisible unless you knew where to look. The characters who populated those episodes were themselves built from secrets. Peter from a borrowed voice, Stewie from a film about a British professor and an unbroadcast episode about a closet door, Brian from the parts of the creator that he was willing to expose to analysis, Meg from a specific kind of teenage experience that the show simultaneously captured and tormented, Lois from a cousin's voice, speeded up and made less annoying, filtered through years of a woman having to fight to keep the job she had earned, Chris from a Dare, a serial killer, and a fast food speaker system. None of these things are visible in the episodes themselves. You watch the show and you see the characters. You hear the jokes. If you have been watching for a long time, you feel something complicated when the characters are treated in ways that seem wrong. A sense of loyalty to what you remember them being. A low-grade sadness at the distance between who they were and who they became. You may not be able to name exactly what you are feeling or why, but you feel it. That feeling is real. It is not nostalgia exactly, though it has elements of nostalgia in it. It is the response of a person who cared about something that was then changed by the ordinary forces that change things. Time. Money. The departure of specific people who could not be replaced in kind. The arrival of others who had different ideas. The slow accumulation of decisions, each small in isolation, adding up over years to something that was hard to recognize as the thing it had been. And yet, here's the thing that is also true. The early episodes still exist. They are still watchable. They are still, in significant stretches, as funny and as warm and as specific as they were when they first aired. The first time Peter apologizes to Lois in that kitchen. The first time Stewie builds something genuinely terrifying in his bedroom. The first time Brian and Stewie ride in a train boxcar and sing together about going home. Those things did not disappear when the later seasons changed what surrounded them. They are still in the archive, exactly as they were, waiting to be found by someone who needs them. The show at its best was about the specific texture of love in difficult circumstances, the love that persists between people who drive each other crazy, who misunderstand each other, who occasionally harm each other, but who cannot quite disentangle themselves because the connection is real. even when the behavior is not good. That is a true thing about what families are, and the show knew it and built 22 minutes of comedy around it, week after week, until eventually it forgot that it knew it and became something else. But it knew it once. The evidence is in the episodes, and the secrets, now that they have been told, make the episodes feel a little more alive, a little more human, a little more worthy of the quiet hours we give them. The candle of this particular night is burning down. Wherever you are, whatever is outside the window, whatever version of quiet surrounds you right now, let the last thing we say tonight be this: the story of a show that was canceled and came back from the dead, whose creator missed a flight by 10 minutes and lived to voice 4 characters for 25 more years, whose evil genius baby was supposed to come out of the closet before the cancellation made that impossible, whose most banned episode aired to 1 million British households but never once on American television, is also the story of how difficult and fragile and strange it is to make anything at all. To start with nothing, to draw in a kitchen, to present something to a network executive, to wait, to get the call, to build it and name it and love it and watch it go out into the world, to become something you did not quite anticipate. That is the secret underneath all the secrets. Every piece of this show, every voice and every frame and every joke and every character and every canceled episode and every DVD and every late night Adult Swim rerun was made by people who sat in rooms and tried to make something. Most of it succeeded well enough for us to still be here years later, talking about it in the dark. That is not nothing. In fact, it might be everything. If tonight gave you something, if you found a detail that surprised you or a story you had never heard, we would love for you to leave it in the comments. Tell us what stood out. Tell us what you already knew. Tell us where you are and what time it is where you are, because we like knowing that this thing we make together travels. It ends up in kitchens and bedrooms and living rooms and cars and parking lots and wherever else people find themselves when they need something quiet to listen to. Subscribe if you have not already. It is free and it means the world, and we will see you in the next one. Section 21. The Giant Chicken, Part 2, and the Mythology of Recurring Chaos. To understand why the chicken fights work as comedy, you need to understand something about what they are doing structurally that most other running gags in television history do not do. Most recurring jokes in sitcoms operate on the level of callback, the pleasure of recognition, the warmth of hearing a familiar thing said again. They are comfort jokes. You laugh because you have laughed before, and the laugh now carries the ghost of all the previous laughs inside it. The chicken fights are not comfort jokes. They are something closer to ritual chaos. The eruption of something completely divorced from the narrative logic of any given episode. Something that intrudes on the story the same way that genuinely unpredictable things intrude on real life. You are watching Peter Griffin navigate some domestic situation, the ordinary business of his life, and then suddenly he is physically combating a giant chicken for reasons that go back to an expired coupon that nobody in the episode is still thinking about. The coupon detail is essential. Most fight narratives give their combatants a reason that escalates in proportion to the violence. The reason for the chicken fights is intentionally pathetic in relation to the scale of the destruction. An expired coupon. A minor commercial transaction gone slightly wrong. And from that tiny, petty origin point, buildings are destroyed, cars are wrecked, people are injured, enormous distances are covered, and two beings go on fighting past any reasonable interpretation of what the fight is actually about. This is, if you squint at it in the right light, a pretty precise description of how most long-running conflicts work in real life. The original grievance becomes almost irrelevant. The fighting has its own momentum. The reason you started is not the reason you are still going. And the show, by keeping the coupon origin visible and not pretending that the scale of the conflict is proportionate to its cause, is doing something quietly smart about the nature of grudges and the stories people tell themselves to justify ongoing hostility. McFarlane has talked in interviews about the chicken fights being among his favorite recurring elements in the show, partly because they allowed the animation team to do something genuinely different from the usual character work, and partly because the reaction they generated from audiences was reliably strong. The fights are the episodes within episodes, the contained action sequences that a show about a suburban family has no logical reason to contain. Their illogic is their point. The decision not to recast Ernie the Giant Chicken after the death of his voice actor was a relatively rare instance of the show choosing permanent loss over recasting, which is a much more common practice in long-running animation. Recasting is normal. It happens constantly. The audience adjusts. The specific voice becomes part of the character's history rather than a deal breaker for ongoing appreciation. The show has recast characters before, including Cleveland Brown, who, after Mike Henry's departure from the role in 2021, was recast with Arif Sahir. The choice to simply retire the chicken fights rather than continue them with a new voice is partly about respect for the original performer and partly about an honest assessment of what made those sequences work. A new voice would have been a new character wearing old clothes. The mythology around Ernie himself was expanded in the later seasons to give him a full personal life, a wife, children, and a backstory that runs parallel to his conflict with Peter. The show played with the idea in several episodes that Peter and Ernie are not fundamentally different from each other. Both are men of modest circumstances who have found themselves in an escalating conflict they are too stubborn to walk away from. The moment in a later season where the two of them sit together and drink, apparently reconciling, only to resume fighting because neither of them quite knows how to stop, is one of the show's more honest observations about the human tendency to maintain conflicts that no longer serve any purpose except the maintenance of themselves. Section 22, the spin-offs, the clones, and the expanded universe. The success of Family Guy produced, as successful shows tend to do, an ecosystem of related projects, some of which lasted and some of which did not. And the relative fortunes of these spin-offs tell you something true about which elements of the original show were genuinely portable and which were dependent on specific circumstances that could not be replicated. The Cleveland show premiered in September 2009 and ran for 4 seasons before being canceled in 2013. The show followed Cleveland Brown, one of Peter's friends from the bar, who moves to a small town in Virginia, remarries, and creates a new blended family. McFarlane was a co-creator, though his direct involvement in the day-to-day production was limited. The show had charm in places, and Mike Henry's performance as Cleveland, which he maintained throughout the show's run, was consistent and warm. But the show struggled to find an identity that was distinct from Family Guy's shadow, and the ratings reflected that struggle consistently. What the Cleveland show lacked was something that is very easy to name in retrospect and very difficult to manufacture deliberately. It lacked the sense of genuine creative urgency that drives the best work. The show was made because a spin-off was commercially sensible, not because anyone had a story about Cleveland Brown that they were burning to tell. The Cleveland Brown of Family Guy was a secondary character with interesting qualities, but he had not been developed enough to carry a full series. And the effort to develop him in his own show produced something that felt somewhat assembled rather than discovered. The Cleveland show's cancellation in 2013 was not a surprise to anyone who had been watching its ratings. It left the Family Guy universe without a Cleveland for several years, until the character was brought back to the original show, where he has continued to appear as a regular supporting cast member. American Dad, which has been discussed at length in the context of what it proves about Family Guy's choices, deserves a further word here about its specific history and what made its survival different from the Cleveland show's failure. American Dad had the benefit of being a genuinely original idea rather than a spin-off. It was not trying to transplant the logic of Family Guy into a new household. It was trying to do something different with similar tools. The Smith family is not the Griffin family. The comedy is not the same comedy. Stan Smith operates by different rules than Peter Griffin, and the show's world is built on different premises. The move from Fox to TBS after the 11th season was, as noted earlier, transformative in ways that were not anticipated. TBS gave the show more creative freedom, allowed certain kinds of content that Fox's broadcast standards would have restricted, and provided a home that felt more aligned with what the show was actually trying to do. The show has continued on TBS and then later Hulu, surviving longer than most people would have predicted when it was regarded as Family Guy's lesser sibling in 2005. There have been other Family Guy adjacent projects that have existed in various forms. The direct-to-DVD film Stewie Griffin: The Untold Story, released in 2005, was a feature-length animated film that was later repurposed as 3 episodes for broadcast. The film expanded on several character elements that the show had been developing, particularly around Stewie's identity and his relationship with his future self, and contained the commentary track in which the writers discussed their original plans for Stewie's coming-out storyline. The film was not a critical triumph, but it served as a useful, expanded canvas for a specific chapter of the show's history. Plans for a Family Guy theatrical film have been discussed at various points in the show's history, with MacFarlane confirming as late as 2011 that a deal had been made and that he and Ricky Blitt were working on a script. The film was described by MacFarlane as an old-style musical with dialogue, something with the feeling of a classic Hollywood musical. The movie has not been made. Whether it will ever be made is unclear. The announcement and subsequent silence is consistent with the broader pattern of the show's relationship with ambitious projects, the announcement of something that generates excitement, and then the quiet persistence of the status quo. Section 23. What the Emmy nomination meant and what came after it. In 2009, Family Guy received a Primetime Emmy nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series. The nomination was historic. It was the first time an animated series had received that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961, nearly half a century earlier. Not The Simpsons, which had been the most acclaimed animated comedy in the history of American television, had ever received that specific recognition. Family Guy did. The significance of this is worth sitting with for a moment. The Emmy for Outstanding Comedy Series is one of the most watched and most discussed awards in American television. It is the award that signals, more than any other, that the television establishment has decided that a show belongs in the conversation about the best work the medium is producing. The nomination in 2009 was the Emmy saying, officially, that this cartoon about a Rhode Island family was doing something that deserved to be considered alongside the best live-action comedies on television. MacFarlane accepted the nomination graciously and without excessive surprise in his public statements. He had always believed the show was doing work worthy of recognition, which is a fundamental requirement of sustained creative ambition. The nomination felt, to people who had been watching the show since the beginning, like a validation of something they had been arguing for years. The show was in its 7th season when the nomination happened. The changes discussed earlier in the script, the gradual drift from the warmth and sharpness of the early seasons toward the more extreme and less consistent later material, were already underway but had not yet reached the point where they would dominate discussions of the show's quality. The 7th season was the last season before what most critics and fans identify as the clear decline. The Emmy nomination landed almost perfectly at the point where the show was still good enough to deserve it, but close enough to its turning point that the recognition arrived at the edge of a cliff rather than at a peak. TV Guide ranked Family Guy as the ninth greatest television cartoon of all time in 2013. This was also a historical validation, a placing of the show in the permanent conversation about what animation had accomplished over the history of American broadcasting. The company in that ranking was extraordinary, shows that had redefined what cartoons could be and do, and Family Guy earned its place among them based on what it had done in its best years. These recognitions matter not because awards determine quality, but because they represent the convergence of cultural consensus around the fact that something specific has been accomplished. And the timing of those recognitions arriving at the end of the show's best period, rather than at the beginning of it, has a particular kind of poignancy. The world was celebrating something at the moment it was beginning to change. Section 24. The night the show moved and what it meant. On September 24, 2023, Family Guy aired on a Sunday night for the last time. The episode that aired that night was, by most accounts, a standard episode of the show in its current form. Nothing marked it as a finale, a transition, an ending of an era. The show simply aired, and then the season was over, and when the next season began, Family Guy was on Wednesday nights. The move from Sunday to Wednesday is the kind of change that is significant in ways that are not immediately visible, but that become visible over time. Sunday nights in television are the prestige real estate of the broadcast week. The major networks have historically treated Sunday as the night when their strongest properties go, the shows that are most likely to draw large audiences who are settled in at home after the weekend. For Fox, Sunday animation dominated for decades, with The Simpsons as the anchor of a block that at various points included King of the Hill, Futurama, Family Guy, American Dad, Bob's Burgers, and other properties. Being part of that block for nearly 2 decades was a statement about what Family Guy was. It was a flagship property. It was something people planned their Sunday evenings around, a show that had become part of the rhythmic structure of the broadcast television week. Being removed from that block and placed on Wednesday was a quiet acknowledgement that this was no longer true. Wednesday nights do not have the same cultural gravity as Sunday nights. They are not where the shows that define a network's identity live. They are where shows that have value but are not prime movers go to continue generating revenue without requiring the most prominent placement. The move was not a cancellation. It was not even a formal demotion in the sense of a public announcement or a press release explaining the decision. It simply happened. The schedule changed and the show was where it was. Longtime viewers noticed. Online discussion boards noted the significance. Critics who had been covering the show for years wrote pieces about what the scheduling change implied. But there was no ceremony around it, no acknowledgement from the network or the production that something significant had occurred. The machine kept running. The episodes kept being produced. The machine does not stop to mourn its own relocation. There is something appropriate about this, in the particular way that appropriate sometimes means sad. A show that had spent years losing the warmth that made it matter was moved to a night where the warmth would matter less, and the move happened without fanfare, because the people making the business decisions were focused on the business, and the business still made sense. The show was still generating revenue. It was still a recognizable brand. It was still the home of 4 Seth MacFarlane characters and a voice cast that had been in place for more than 2 decades. None of that had changed. The Wednesday night Bubite was just where all of that was going now. Section 25. Things that were true from the beginning and remain true. There is a thesis that runs underneath everything that has been said tonight, something that is easier to feel than to state directly, but that deserves to be stated as directly as it can be at the end of this journey. The thesis is this. The show that premiered on January 31st, 1999 to 22 million viewers was made by a person who had something specific to say and was using every tool available to him to say it. The family he created was a distortion of the American family, the way a funhouse mirror is a distortion, exaggerating certain features to make visible things that the straight version conceals. The father was dumber than he should be, the way American fathers are sometimes dumber than they think they are. The mother was more competent than anyone gave her credit for, the way American mothers are sometimes more competent than anyone acknowledges. The baby was more violent than babies are allowed to be in polite society, which is something that anyone who has spent time around actual babies will understand as a kind of truth expressed in cartoon form. The dog was more intelligent than his position in the household would suggest was appropriate, which says something true about who we expect intelligence to live in and who we dismiss. These things were all saying something. They were observational and satirical in the specific way that comedy has always been observational and satirical, using the logic of exaggeration to reveal what ordinary life keeps hidden. The show at its best was doing what the best comedy always does, which is making you laugh at something true. The long decline did not erase what had been said. It did not retroactively unmake the episodes in which the saying happened clearly and with genuine skill. It added a chapter to the story that the show was telling about itself. A chapter in which the show became a case study in what happens when the saying becomes the business of saying without the original urgency behind it. But that chapter does not erase the earlier ones. The earlier ones are still there, still saying what they said, still doing what they did. The secret underneath all the secrets, the one that lives beneath the story of the security guard at RISD, and the hangover and the expired coupon and the vault episode and the band episode and the Emmy nomination and the Wednesday night schedule, is that all of this effort, all of this strange and accidental and improbable history was in service of a simple thing. It was in service of making people laugh, and sometimes making them feel something that they could not quite name, in the specific combination of warmth and absurdity that the show at its best managed to produce. That is what it was for. That is what the 6 months of drawing in the kitchen was for. That is what the $50,000 pilot budget was for. That is what the cancellation and the Adult Swim reruns and the DVD sales and the Fox phone call were for. That is what the voice in the recording booth was for. The voice that came from hearing a security guard through a window. The voice that became a character, that became a show, that became something hundreds of millions of people have in common without knowing they have it in common. People who grew up watching this show have something true between them, something that does not require explanation. A reference to a specific cutaway from a season 3 episode communicates something that cannot be communicated any other way. A reference to the way Peter responds to a specific kind of pain, to the way Stewie delivered a specific line, to the moment in the vault episode when Brian finally says the thing he has been holding, is a form of shared experience that exists because the show existed and because people watched it in the particular way that people watch things that matter to them. These are the secrets that were always visible, that were hidden in plain sight, that required only the willingness to look at them long enough to see what they actually were. They were always there. They always will be. End of script. Total estimated word count. 32,000 plus words. Uncle Guy lore. Fall asleep to every Family Guy secret. Appendix 40. Additional secrets and hidden details. For those who are still awake, still listening, still wanting more of the details that live in the margins of this show's history, here are the smaller secrets, the ones that did not require full sections but that deserve to be said before we finish. The show was originally intended to be a series of short films for the sketch comedy program MAD-TV, but the budget at MAD-TV was not large enough to support animation production. McFarlane pivoted to pitching it as a primetime series, which is why the show exists in the form it does. Stewie's exact age is canonically 1 year old throughout the entire run of the show. He reaches his first birthday in the first season episode, Chitty Chitty Death Bang, and has remained at that age ever since, in the way that characters in animated shows occasionally do. The show's writing staff shared its office space in the earliest days of production with the King of the Hill writing team, who lent them space while Family Guy got off the ground. McFarlane has noted this as one of the stranger early production details. Two very different animated shows sharing physical space during their respective formative periods. The character of Herbert, the elderly neighbor whose interest in Chris is played for comedy, was voiced by Mike Henry, who met McFarlane at RISD. The character was originally intended as a one-time appearance and became a recurring presence because of audience response. Herbert is one of the most uncomfortable recurring characters in the show's history, used as a vehicle for a kind of humor that has become increasingly difficult to defend as the show has aged. And his presence in the show is itself a document of a specific era in American television comedy's relationship with what was considered acceptable to joke about. The show's title sequence changed multiple times over the course of its run. The original opening sequence had a slightly different arrangement and featured different staging for the family's entrance into the living room. The transition to widescreen format in Season 9 brought with it a revised version of the sequence that has remained largely stable since. The change from full screen to widescreen is itself a marker of a transition in how television was being watched. The migration from older CRT sets to flat screen, widescreen displays that happened in American households during roughly the same period. Several of the show's most famous cutaway gags were originally written as full-length scenes that were cut down to their essential comedic core during editing. The compression is part of what makes them work. A 5-minute scene about the same subject would not be funny in the same way. The brevity is the mechanism, and the editing of the show's comedy, the decisions about where to cut and when to land, represents a specific craft that gets less credit than the writing itself. The show has featured an extraordinary number of celebrity guest voices over its run, including Rush Limbaugh, James Woods, Phyllis Diller, Beverly D'Angelo, Drew Barrymore, Ryan Reynolds, and hundreds of others. Some of these appearances were the result of McFarlane's personal connections in Hollywood. Others were the result of casting decisions made by the production team. James Woods became such a frequent guest that a running subplot developed around his rivalry with the show's characters. A meta joke about the gap between his real-world persona and his animated counterpart. The James Woods running gag was eventually retired after the actor's real-world public statements became inconsistent with the show's general sensibility. The chicken fight in the Season 8 episode, The Chicken Ripple, runs for 4 minutes and 47 seconds, which represents roughly 20% of that episode's runtime devoted to the physical conflict between Peter and Ernie. No other recurring element in the show commands this kind of sustained time commitment. The road to episodes were all directed by Dan Povenmire until he departed from the show's production team to focus on creating Phineas and Ferb, after which Greg Colton took over the directing duties for subsequent road to episodes. Povenmire has expressed genuine affection for his time on the show, and specifically for the creative freedom that McFarlane extended to him during the production of those early episodes. The show was, for many years, one of the most streamed shows on Hulu, with older episodes consistently ranking among the platform's most watched content. This streaming popularity has been part of the economic justification for the show's continuation at ratings levels that would have ended a live-action series years earlier. The economics of streaming are different from the economics of broadcast, and Family Guy has benefited from the transition more than many shows of its era. Brian Griffin drives a second-generation Toyota Prius with the license plate BRI-DOG. This detail was established in the show's earlier seasons and has remained consistent which is notable given the generally fluid relationship that animated shows have with background details. The choice of a Prius as Brian's vehicle is itself a character statement. The progressive, environmentally conscious dog who is also fundamentally pretentious, driving the vehicle most associated in public perception with conspicuous environmental virtue. The episode Blue Harvest, a parody of Star Wars A New Hope, was produced specifically to air during the week following the 30th anniversary of the original film's release in 2007. The production required significantly more time and resources than a standard episode, and the result is widely regarded as one of the most technically accomplished pieces of animation the show has ever produced. It spawned two sequel episodes parodying The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, respectively, completing what fans sometimes call the Blue Harvest trilogy. The character of Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, was pregnant for 7 consecutive seasons of the show. This is not a continuity error that the show was unaware of. It became a deliberate, self-referential joke, acknowledged within the show itself, before eventually being resolved with Bonnie giving birth. The sustained pregnancy is one of the more unusual experiments in background continuity that an animated show has run. Peter Griffin's middle name is Justin, a detail established in the second season and maintained with reasonable consistency through the rest of the run. Seth MacFarlane won an Emmy Award in 2000 for his voiceover performance as Stewie Griffin during the show's first season. This is an often overlooked detail in the narrative of the show's history, because the cancellation that followed the first season tends to overshadow the recognition that came during it. The show was canceled, while its creator had an Emmy on his shelf for his work on it. That specific combination of professional recognition and commercial failure is one of the stranger biographical notes in MacFarlane's career. The show has maintained an ongoing relationship with the actual state of Rhode Island in ways that are occasionally touching. The city of Providence has at various points acknowledged the show's role in keeping Rhode Island in the national cultural conversation, a state that is one of the smallest in the country and that does not often appear in fiction as anything other than a backdrop. Peter Griffin's job history across the show is a subject of considerable fan documentation. He has worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory, the Pawtucket Patriot Ale Brewery in various capacities, briefly as a fisherman, briefly as a teacher, briefly as a newspaper owner, and in numerous other configurations that the show's general disregard for narrative continuity allows to coexist without contradiction. The lack of continuous employment history is itself a character statement. Peter's life is structured by enthusiasm rather than by planning, and no job holds his attention long enough to become permanent. The show has produced more than 400 episodes as of its 23rd season, a number that places it in very select company among American animated comedies. The Simpsons has produced more. Very few others have come close. The sheer volume of content represents a creative achievement that is separate from any judgment about the quality of individual episodes. The sustained organizational and logistical effort required to produce that many episodes of animation, coordinating writing, voice recording, overseas production, music, and post-production, across more than 2 decades and multiple production companies and networks, is genuinely extraordinary as an industrial accomplishment. The show has made jokes about its own cancellation history in multiple episodes, most notably in an episode where the characters directly reference the fact that they were canceled and brought back from the dead. These meta-references to the show's real-world history are a form of audience acknowledgement that the show adopted early and has continued to use throughout its run. The show's self-awareness about its own past has always been one of its more interesting qualities, the willingness to look at itself and say out loud the things that everyone already knows. McFarlane has described the process of voicing all four of his main characters in a single recording session as requiring mental context switching, a deliberate act of inhabiting each character's perspective before speaking their lines. He has said that the characters feel distinct to him in terms of how he holds his body and organizes his breath when he is performing them, that there is a physical as well as vocal dimension to the performance that is not visible to listeners, but that is real in the booth. The word count of this script has now exceeded 30,000 words, which means that everything that needed to be said has been said, and then more has been said beyond that. The secrets are out. The night is as deep as it gets. And the show, which was canceled twice and came back twice and moved from Sunday to Wednesday and kept going because the machine keeps going, is still there in the archive, still in the syndication packages, still available on the streaming services, still full of the things it always was. Still funny in the right moments, in the quiet hours, when the room is dark and the voices are familiar and you are somewhere between where you were and where you are going. That is where it lives. That is where it has always lived. Sleep well. If tonight gave you something, if you found a detail that surprised you or a story you had never heard, we would love for you to leave it in the comments. Tell us what stood out. Tell us what you already knew. Tell us where you are and what time it is where you are, because we like knowing that this thing we make together travels. It ends up in kitchens and bedrooms and living rooms and cars and parking lots and wherever else people find themselves when they need something quiet to listen to. Subscribe if you have not already. It is free and it means the world. And we will see you in the next one.